Hey folks, greetings. Welcome to the pre-show. Just getting set up. How's everybody doing tonight? Hope you had a good day. I did. So, let's see what we got going here. All right. That seems odd. Things seem off. Huh. Let me try something. Hold on. This is still the pre-show, so we're good. I just want to make sure I'm all lined up here. There we are. We'll bring that back up. How's everyone doing tonight? All right, sound check, testing 1, 2. All right, we go live over on the radio station in about 2 minutes. And that's over at Odyssey Radio, ODYSY radio.com. Good Friday has been great to me, said Field Guy. That's good. Very good to hear. Hey, Niall. I am as well a big advocate of the legitimacy of the Shroud. I still have my doubts, but I think it's the real item. Tonight, it's not super intense with my detail and my facts that I'm going to be presenting. It's just kind of the Shroud light, and we're going to talk about it a little bit. There's so much information. I don't want to do anything much more in-depth until I get a lot more photos available, a lot more information in front of me available, and hopefully get Barry Schwartz on here again, and we'll all talk about it. But tonight should be a good primer for people who don't know much about it. We're going to talk about the resurrection. We're going to talk about Jesus, things like that, and why the Shroud matters, and why I think it's real. And some of the misgivings that we were given when I was younger as to why it wouldn't be real. So I think it'll be an excellent show. Okay, we're coming on, so everybody sit tight. Be right back.
The Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Greetings and felicitations, everyone. Welcome to the program. I'm Scotty Roberts. I'm your host, and this is the Intrepid radio program. Right here on Odyssey Radio. That's ODYSY radio.com. And you can hear the radio show live in its audio glory over on that show. If you want to join us for the chat room and the visuals that we'll have tonight, the simulcast over on YouTube, come to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Scotty Roberts. Oh, let me do this before we get too far. There we go. All right. That's not, that's just a soda. It was a sound effect. So welcome, everybody. I'm glad that you're here tonight. Happy Good Friday. I don't know how many of you are Christian or celebrate Christianity and celebrate the Easter time, but I know many of us in the West do. And so I don't know if you all had a Friday service, Good Friday services that you attended, or if you are a Christian or celebrate or worship on Easter and Good Friday. And so, of course, Good Friday, if you don't know by any chance, this is the day. I asked my own children, believe it or not, some of my own kids did not know what Good Friday was. That's how out of the norm worshiping at churches has become for us as a family. Well, it was my youngest that didn't know, and so I said, well, Good Friday is celebrating or observing the traditional day that Jesus was crucified on the cross. Grumpy attended the Church of Natural Light, he said today. Interesting. Is that the outdoors, the great outdoors, outside your shop? So I see that Niall is here, and he was here a little earlier. He says, I'm a big advocate of the legitimacy of the Shroud of Turin, one being its journey and the other being its makeup. We'll expound when you come on. He said the eccrine excretions on the shroud are undeniable, stained through extreme organized sweat, basically, and impossible to fake, as is the age of the plants which formed the linen. And, one thing I have to say about the Shroud of Turin is all the arguments I keep reading about those who claim that it's still a fake are basically, they sound to me, I can almost hear their voice or imagine what they sound like as they're decrying this as from a scientific, pontification point of view of how the shroud is just simply, not it's a middle-aged forgery or a medieval forgery and all these things, and they don't want to account for any of the information or the evidence that's been given. And that evidence is mounting. And there are several places that you can go online. One of the big places is shroud.com. And you can dig through all of the information they have there. And for me to have extrapolated or extracted that information and photos and represented it here would be and I've done a little bit of that tonight for tonight, but it would be easier for me, let's put it this way, for me to say, you need to go there and dig into this topic, and hopefully what I will present tonight will whet your interest a little bit if you don't already have interest in it. Jason said a little bit earlier, carbon-14 dating probably gets interesting with it, that's for sure, given everything it's been through. Yeah, that's exactly it. I know that there was carbon-14 dating that was done on the shroud back in the mid 1980s, I think, or the late 1980s. It might have been a little bit later than that, where they came out and conclusively said the shroud is medieval. It's from the 15th century. And so it's got to be a 15th century forgery. And that kind of put it to bed for a while, or at least it seemed to, what's the word I want to use for that? It stifled the believers a little bit, and when you believe something, by the way, there's almost no amount of scientific evidence that can take away the belief, because there's always a reason you can get around the scientific aspects of something if you have faith in something. And so science doesn't always cut it for people of faith. And then, of course, they found that they did more testing, different kinds of testing, but they found that, this shroud, as Jason just referred to, this shroud has been through hell and back, literally, when it comes to attempting to scientifically date the thing with carbon-14, because it has been through 3 fires. It's been through, I think, 2 floodings. It has been through several countries, traveled by hand, handled by many people early on. And so what they determined was the fibers that the church had let them take for carbon-14 dating were all taken from the edges, like the edges of the fabric. If this is your shroud right here, it would be It was all handled. It was handled from the sides, the edges, and folded and things like that. And so it was all the edges, and that's where they took the fibers. So they're picking up fibers from people's skin oils, and everybody that had handled it in previous ages. So they later have done some carbon-14 dating, as well as other types of date testing, and from more central areas on the shroud where people don't normally touch it. And the thing has dated back 2,000 years. It dates to the 1st century, as well as having pollens and all kinds of other things like that from the 1st century embedded into the shroud. By the way, we kind of jumped into it there, just answering some of the things on here. Now, Ryan Gale says the carbon dating proved it dates after the death of Jesus. Not very far after the death of Jesus, though. It still dates to the 1st century. So I think, Brian, were you referring to the original carbon dating, where they only took 2 fibers in the original one, or 1 fiber or 2 fibers, and cut it into 3 pieces? And they usually need something like 8 or 9. There's all kinds of things that have been released with the there was an action to make all that data available to what they did with the carbon dating, and there was definitely a bias in the reporting of that carbon dating, a bias to cover up is what it appeared to be, because there were a lot, apparently, and I did not read into this too deeply, but there was a hell of a lot of information that was misleading, as well as just the carbon dating test itself. So, Ryan, if you're referring to the carbon dating that came out 10, 20 years ago that said that the shroud was medieval, those were erroneous tests, because they've done several tests since then that prove it's 2,000 years old, which is interesting. So if that's what you're talking about, as far as it came out after the death of Jesus, that would have been the original date, test dating that was done. But let's move on. Hey, Roy. Hey, Claudette. Hey, Susie Q and Elderberry, and everybody that's coming in. Ryan Gale, of course, and Morgan Snow, and Niles here, and Grumpy Stack, and all kinds of you are here tonight. And good to see you. And those of you in the audience that are not in the chat room, I want you to know you can come and join the chat room. It's a lot of good people there. Nobody's going to bite you too hard. And unless you're just here to listen, you're like, I don't participate in that stuff, and you're here just to listen, that's fine too. So welcome, everybody, and appreciate you being here. And let's see. I feel like I got the show off kind of weird, because I didn't really introduce the show very well. We just played the introduction, and then we jumped right into talking to comments that were put up. And so I'm glad everybody. Oh, Josh Kemp, good to see you, by the way. And Jason, good to see you. So you are listening to the Intrepid radio program. That's me right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And tonight, I want to talk about, you all know where I am faith-wise. The things I've struggled with, just by virtue of the fact that I said a few minutes ago that some of my own kids don't even know what Good Friday is. And my youngest. And I had to explain what that was. And it made me pause and say, I have not even raised my kids understanding some of these things. And I'll get there, Niall, with the full screen. I just wanted to keep that graphic up for a few minutes for people that are coming in. I will say that if you look at that graphic, that is an illustration that I did of Jesus based very tightly on the Shroud of Turin. This was done for a book for a man that hired me to do a bunch of illustrations for him, and on his book on the Passion. And he wanted me to do an illustration of Jesus, his face, based on the shroud. So that's why that's there. That's why I kept that up a little bit. And so we want to talk about this. And by the way, I want to show you one other. Let me just show you a couple of pictures I've got. I'm going to pull these up. If you are not familiar with the shroud, let me pull this up for you. Here is, and you can't see this in great detail, but here is the shroud on the right, and it's showing kind of in a negative is what it looks like. And this was the interesting thing. When they did the photography of the shroud, very light image on the shroud. Here's a better image of the shroud itself. Very light image. You can see it on the bottom portion, the white portion of this is how that image looks on the shroud. And if you can see right down the middle would be the top of the head, and then to the left is his back, to the right is his front, and it was one piece of fabric that he was laid on top of, and the linen was brought over the top. Whoever the man is on the shroud, that's the way he's positioned. And so you see right smack down the middle of this shroud picture would be the top of his head. And so then on the top image, the darker image, they noticed when they shot pictures and they were developing the pictures back in the late 70s, they saw the image in negative. And they said, whoa, wait a minute. Because you see in these top images, you're getting a positive image of the man on the shroud, which was the first they really kind of realized that, wait a minute, the image on the shroud is a negative image, as if it's a negative from film. And so whatever put the image on the shroud, let's say a guy painted it in medieval times, he would have had to painted the image in negative. And so that's one of the things that's got going against the faking of the shroud. Niall says, when I grew up, we used to call Good Friday the agony, based on the 13 stations. Very Catholic upbringing. I understand that. Let's see. Ryan says, I saw a photo of the shroud as a kid, and it scared the poop out of me. Yeah, it's kind of a scary image when you think about it. Here is a close-up of the face in the negative of the negative, making it a positive on black. And so this is how the negative turned out when they shot the shroud. And people say, the face, the body, everything looks a little distorted. It doesn't look quite right. Now, and one thing they figured out too in doing all the mathematics of the depth of the image that's on the shroud and all this, and this is where I say, I'm not going to speak in the scientific terms about this. I'm going to talk about some of the generalities about this, and I'm going to bring up some points about the veracity of the shroud, and then the veracity, and I want you to stick around for this, the evidence of resurrection, not connected to the shroud, not coming from the shroud, but as a result of the shroud is what we add to that evidence. So, I'm saying that all wrong. I'm sorry. The shroud is not what we're adding to the evidence. We're going to talk about the shroud, and then talk about the evidence of the resurrection. And so my brain is wanting to rush ahead to the next step, and that's why I'm doing that. But they talk about how the shroud was, you're looking at a flat image on a flat piece of fabric like this. It would be flat that I'm holding this up. But when they put the shroud over his face, what did it do? It tents in the middle like this when it lays over his face. So the image would have been burned into the shroud when it's in this position. And then you straighten that, flatten that out, and you've got a face that's gone from this to being flattened out. And that's the way the body looks as well. It's in certain elements on the body. And so they started doing, and I'm going to jump a little bit ahead here, but they started doing some 3D reconstructions of the face. And I've seen several different ones, but the one that was taken right from the shroud, you saw my version right here. There's my version of the art. This is just watercolor I did of the face on the shroud. Now, this is one that was taken right from the shroud. as well, right here. So that image was taken from this image, allowing for the tenting of the fabric on the face, and so on and so on and so on. So this is probably one of the most accurate illustrations done from the three-dimensional information that they pulled off of the shroud. And I found that to be very fascinating. So what I want to get into here is a little bit of the reasons that the Shroud of Turin is a real thing. And I've got 7 reasons. And I will tell you this, I am not Catholic, but I've gone to Catholic information. And so you're going to get a taste of the explanations that are given are going to be very, for lack of any better way to say it, or a more common way to say it, churchified. They're going to be the way the church views it. And it's going to be something that will give you information as from being presented from people that are technical about it, are scientific about it, but they are also firm believers in it as a biased starting point, which I don't see anything wrong with that, because I believe you can be biased and believe something and still be able to present detailed information about something. It's like me. I'm biased about Senenmut being Moses, that guy up there. But if I got information that proved that my theory was wrong, I could go with it as long as I had substantive information that was thrown my way. So same thing with a church believer presenting this. I don't think that necessarily presents a conflict of interest, is what I'm trying to say. So there's 7 reasons proving the Shroud of Turin is the real image of Jesus. Now, think of this for a second. And I want to bring this up too. When we first heard about the Shroud of Turin, when I was a young man, and it was discussed in our seminary and church and so on, and we were told that is not the image of Jesus Christ, because God would never leave an image of himself behind, because he would not want people worshiping that image. And it would, in and of itself, it would violate the commandment to not worship images and false. Remember, in Judaism, they didn't allow imagery of any kind that depicted faces and so on. It was shunned, and it was taught against, because that would lead to idolatry and the worship of something that is an object or an idol, as opposed to God himself. Even there, when Pontius Pilate, one of the rebellions that he quelled in Israel, it was I believe it was in Caesarea Philippi. It might have been in Jerusalem. I've got to refresh my memory on this, but there was the Shield Rebellion, where he brought shields into the it was Jerusalem, because it was in the Antonium complex, the Roman fort that was connected to the north end of the temple platform, where you can see the ruins of it today in Jerusalem, at the north end of where the platform where the Mosque of Omar sits. And that Roman fort, he brought in shields that had images of Caesar on them. And the Jews in Israel rebelled against that. They had a sit-in, and it became quite a messy affair very early on. And he did that, and there was a belief that he did that to insult the Jews, because remember, he was an appointee of Aelius Sejanus. Sejanus was Caesar's right-hand man, while Caesar's in his dotage filming the movie Caligula over on the Isle of Capri. That'll make sense to some of you. Some of you it won't. He was in his dotage in retirement over on the Isle of Capri, And he left Sejanus in charge, and Sejanus started filling high positions with his allies, and he was anti-Semitic, and that was kind of his policy: subjugate the Jews in Jerusalem, or in Israel, or Judea at the time. Randall Flagg says, yet God leaves all sorts of things that we can use to commit sins. Absolutely, he does. So I fought against that notion, even very early on. And I always had a pretty skeptical belief in the shroud being the image of Christ, especially when you learn about all the research that has been done and all the things that it can't possibly be, and all the almost impossibilities that would have to take place for that image to actually be there. It's not a common thing. You don't find these things. And so let's go through these 7 things, first of all. Because if you're like me, you may have wondered if there's any way to ever validate the image that's on the shroud. And is it really Jesus? And there's a guy, professor of mathematical physics at the University of Turin, and he's vice president of the Brotherhood of the Holy Shroud. Bruno Barberis provides a bunch of reasons why how we can shed some light on this. And by the way, just because he's a professor of mathematics, he's at the university and so on, that makes him scientific. It gives him credential, but he's also the president of the Brotherhood of the Holy Shroud, which tells you he's already invested in belief in it. Now, does that bias his opinion? It doesn't have to. That's the thing we got to look at. So Barberis is certain that the figure of the man on the shroud is of Jesus of Nazareth. He explained the reasons at the International Congress on Science and Faith in the shroud. And the question was, who is the man of the shroud according to science? So number 1, the man in the shroud is wrapped in a sheet. Now, both Jesus, and these are very simple answers he's giving, but it's 7 points. Both Jesus and the man on the shroud were wrapped in a sheet after death, which was very rare in antiquity, especially in the case of crucifixion. In fact, the corpse was often left to wild animals or buried in mass graves. And not only was, and some of you have heard of this, and we've made mention of it here before, somewhere, I'm sorry, I'm reading what Niall said here at the same time, and I distracted myself. He says, does it not say somewhere in Corinthians, look for my face? I'm not sure. That's not ringing a bell off the top of my head, Niall. But we'll have to look that up in Corinthians. Somebody take and look up, look for my face, Corinthians, and see if it comes up with anything in the New Testament, if there's a verse we can find for that. But not only is there the shroud that he was wrapped in, and he's wrapped up in this shroud, it's said that there was, if you look at the account of the burial of Jesus, it says that they took off the face cloth and folded it up and set it beside him, and he's wrapped in the shroud on the grave, in the grave. And so there was a secondary cloth. Now that cloth in Latin is referred to as sudarium, just means a big face cloth, like a big hand towel. It's about like this size. And I want to show you a picture of this. Now, you saw the shroud. First of all, let's add this again. You can see the face here. And when you look at this face, there are blood stains. You see the white up here on the forehead and the top of the head and the hair. That's some of the blood stains that are on the shroud. If you look at this, it's a little harder to see because it's a little small. But it's got all these things pointing out all the blood stains, all the scarring from the lashing, the flagrum marks. The flagrum was the three-tailed whip with the double balls at the end of each tail that would rip into the skin. What does Kevin Thompson say? Perhaps he was revered by his followers. Even after his death, The Roman soldier said, "This is the one, the Christ they speak of." Yeah, exactly. I think some of them probably believed because of what happened. But now you've got this cloth called the sudarium. Have you heard of this? This is the sudarium right here. This piece of cloth was found. Oh my, I don't have it up in front of me. Let's see. I can't remember how to pronounce where they found this. I think it's Ovidum or something like that. They found this secondary piece of cloth, the sudarium. And the sudarium would be like a face towel or a hand towel or something like that. And accordingly, they say, historically, what may the surmising of these two pieces of cloth now is that the sudarium was used to cover his face and his head. And then they took him down from the cross and they brought him to the tomb. They wrapped him in the shroud, but they took off the face cloth. And this is one of the reasons they say there wasn't a lot of blood off the face and the head on the shroud itself, because they attribute that to this piece of cloth that you're looking at here having been put on his face first. And you can see, the impressions where the eyes would have been, the blood that would have gone down the side of the head to the back of the head. They say that this sudarium, but from the markings on it, was probably laid over his head and a strip of cloth just loosely tied around it to keep it on his face while they carried him to the grave. And then this was removed, the shroud was put on, and now this piece of cloth, totally separate from the Shroud of Turin, discovered on very different dates. And they found that this cloth, when they take it and they match it up to in a transparency to the shroud, there's a perfect matching of the blood stains to the blood stains on the shroud and the facial structure on the shroud, except there's more blood stain on the sudarium than there is on the shroud itself, which I find very fascinating. Oviedo, there it is. Thank you, Kevin. Oviedo. Barbie D says, Scotty and everybody, can't stay. Just wanted to wish everybody who celebrate a very blessed Easter. Thank you, Barbie D. Sure appreciate that. So this sudarium was another piece of cloth that was found that was connected to, or they found that is matches and is connected to the Shroud of Turin. Let's go back to these 7 reasons here. So Jesus was wrapped in a sheet or a linen cloth. And some people, one of the discreditings that has tried to happen is, linen doesn't last that long. It would have decayed by now at 2,000 years old. Well, no, that's not necessarily true. We have linen dress shirts from 5,000 years ago that have survived. So linen is a very ruddy fabric, and it'll hold up. Rugged fabric, not ruddy. So Jacques Demolay on the Shroud of Turin. Are you saying it looks like Jacques Demolay? Maybe. Wasn't he bald? What else did I see from Niall? He says, I think his face was wiped, but there was some heavy flows of blood which came down the forehead, including the famous 3. Yes. And that's what you see, what Niall is speaking of here. All of these coming down from the forehead and so on the shroud. So let's move on. That's reason number 1 that that proved the Shroud of Turin is the real image of Jesus. Now, just because Jesus is said in the account to have been wrapped in a sheet, and that the man on the the shroud is wrapped in a sheet, does that automatically make it Jesus? No. This is just number 1. Number 2, the crown of thorns. Both Jesus and the man on the shroud were wearing crowns of thorns on their head. And this fact is really exceptional because there's no historical document that describes this as any sort of custom in crucifixion other than the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, the man on the shroud is wearing a crown of thorns. There's thorns around his head. Now, and I could not find an image of this, but something they've done since these initial photographs were taken of the shroud, they've been able to find penetrate the imagery a little deeper with more modern technology, and they have found that around his head is not just thorns, but there are puncture marks that they can see, but there is also leaves. So the crown is still on him. Now, I don't know if there was a reason they would not have taken that off of him when they buried him. But remember, it says they did this all very quickly. It said that they brought him to the tomb, put him in the shroud, laid him in the tomb, sealed the tomb, rolled the stone over the door, and they did it quickly without washing the body, without preparing him for burial. And they just left him as he was. And I think it's because they were afraid. They were afraid that they were going to get nailed. And so they laid him in the tomb. They left him. They were going to come back and take care of that business later. As a matter of fact, that's what Mary was doing on Easter morning, Sunday morning, was she was coming to anoint the body. And so if he still has the crown of thorns, he still has blood on the body that got onto the shroud. It's because the body had not been prepared for burial. And you're seeing that reflected in the shroud. Let's see. JP says, read DEC's comment. Molay was burned. Oh, yeah, there you go. Red, along with a bunch of other Templars. That's very true. Yeah, he was burned at the stake. Niall says, chances are the thorns were embedded deeply in the flesh, so removing the crown would take an effort to remove. I would assume that same thing. That's subjective, but I assume the same thing. So we've got 2 of these 7 reasons. 1, wrapped in a shroud, and 2, there was a crown of thorns on both of them. Number 3, transporting the cross. Now, like Jesus in the account in the New Testament, the man of the shroud has the marks of having carried a heavy object on his shoulders, which can only be the cross on which he was nailed. Not necessarily. This is where you find, this is how bias arguments will state something. Well, that could only mean it was the crossbar that he was carrying. No, it doesn't mean that. It means that he carried something heavy. But this guy has the marks on his body of recently prior to death carrying something very heavy on his shoulders. And so the condemned carrying the gallows was not performed at all crucifixions, as they occasionally used trees or crosses or scaffoldings that had crossbars on them permanently, or uprights, and they would drop them into the crossbar or into the upright. And so him carrying, I think he just carried the crossbeam is my guess, because I believe that there were so many crucifixions that were done that the outside of the city walls, they had a gallows built, a scaffolding, and the condemned would have to carry his crossbeam, because one of the parts of crucifixion was they would nail the wrists to the crossbeam and then hoist it up and drop it into place on the scaffolding, which would dislocate the shoulders, which was part of the science, if you will, of cruel execution. They would dislocate the shoulders, then they would push the knees up toward the chest, nail the feet, and it would contract the diaphragm. So here's the condemned hanging on the crossbeam, having his shoulders dislocated, his knees up to his chest, and in order to breathe, he's got to lift up on those dislocated arms and push up on the nail-driven feet in order to allow his diaphragm to breathe in and take breath in. So the only way he could prolong his own life and not die of suffocation was to push up on those nails and lift up on the shoulders that were out of joint. Now they could do this too by nailing somebody to the cross and dropping the cross into a hole as well, the whole cross, the upright and everything. So the other thing they did, which will come up later as we talk more about this, is remember it said that when they came to Jesus to break his legs, that they saw he was already dead, so they didn't break his legs, but they did pierce his side with a spear. Why was that mentioned? Because it doesn't say, and it was a common practice to break the legs, but it was a common practice of crucifixion. After so many hours, to either be merciful, but what a nasty way to accept mercy, but to end the life of the person on the cross. It was because dying up there was like dying of suffocation. And they break the legs of the prisoner that's being the guy being executed, so he could no longer push up on his legs. So they'd go around with a big club and they'd break the legs. And it says that they didn't break his legs because they saw he was already dead, which was supposed to also be a fulfillment of prophecy that that it said he would not have a bone broken, the Messiah. So JP says the 1600s was not the medieval period, Reverend. No, it wasn't. Yeah, the 1600s is a little late for medieval. So what did the church use to increase attendance? Carbon dating? Carbon dating on the shroud showed it was from the 1600s. 16th century, or I think they said 15th century, which would make it the 1400s, is what they said. But the carbon dating, remember, was erroneous when they said that. There were several flaws in the process and several problems with the way they carbon dated. And they did another carbon dating, Rabbit Dog and others, that put the shroud into the 1st century. When it was done properly, they used more than the 1 or 2 snippets of fiber that they were allowed to take the first time. And they took it from more central portions of the shroud, and they ended up with a date that pushed that shroud back into the 1st century. So if you're stuck on the 16th or even the 15th century as the dating of the shroud by carbon dating, realize that you're repeating that information that has been found to be erroneous information. So you got to take that out of the lexicon, if you will, of discussing the age of the shroud and the scientific portions of the shroud, that it doesn't date to the 1600s. The DNA they pulled off of the shroud that dated it to the 16th or the 15th century was probably the element. They were allowed to take fibers from the outer edges of the shroud. I explained this at the beginning of the show. If this were the shroud, it was not handled by going like this. Oh, let's take this shroud and move it around. No, they didn't touch it. It was a relic. And anybody who handled it had to handle it from the edges. And this is where they also took the fibers, which means they picked up the DNA of all the people that had handled that shroud for 2,000 years off the edges. So when they took it from more central locations, then you got something that was more accurate. The piercing of the crucified was probably as simple as finding out if he reacted. Yeah, exactly. Or if he was dead or not. And I'm sure many passed in and out of consciousness. Yeah. That was one of the theories. Well, Christ never died. He swooned on the cross. And when they took him down, he was still alive. That's one of the theories that's out there. And that's not what would have happened. And so let's go on and look at more of these reasons. And number 3 was carrying the cross. Number 4, the use of nails. Now, both Jesus and the man on the shroud were nailed to a cross. And this method seems to have been reserved for official crucifixions, while in most cases, the condemned were fixed to the cross with ropes. So it was reserved for official crucifixions, the use of nails. The condemned were fixed to the cross with ropes otherwise. So they could rope you up to the cross. And it's saying that so it was not a common practice to use nails. It was common for official acts of crucifixion. Number 5, the unbroken legs, which we just addressed. Both Jesus and the man on the shroud were injured in the side after the death with unbroken legs. And this is unique when it comes to crucifixion, as breaking the legs of the crucified was meant to hasten death, and it was more common. Now, if you look at this again, you will notice, I think this diagram shows it a little better right here. You can't see where I'm pointing, but if you look at the lower portion of the image here that shows him standing facing us head to toe, the upper portion would be the flip side of the shroud that was wrapped around his head, over his head and down his back. That's the backside, upside down from head to toe at the very top. But if you look at the bottom portion of the shroud right here, they've marked it in red. You see the blood from the lance wound is in the right side. And so all of this area, and if you look over to the shroud image, which they've darkened up a little bit because the shroud is not that dark. But if you correlate and go over to the shroud over on the right, you can see that darkened area where there is oxidized blood. And if you look at the back side of the image, that oxidized blood is on the beneath the rib cage as well, meaning it when he was laid in the shroud, it still dripped down and pooled onto his back. So there you've got the wound of the spear, but neither of his legs were broken. And by the way, you see all in this diagram here, you see all of the whipping marks, the scourging marks, front and back, with the Roman flagrum. So Niles says woodcuts showing various showings of the shroud exist. And it was a grand event, and it was held by the coroners. So DNA contamination everywhere. Yes, exactly. And by the way, you mentioned the wood carvings that show the shroud. It's interesting that a lot of your Byzantine art of Jesus, where we get that stereotypic, look up the Byzantine Christ painted on church walls and things like that. And you've got the look for Christ was established by something. And if you compare, they've even taken the image on the shroud and compared it and overlaid it and laid them side by side, and with some of this Byzantine art of Jesus, and they're a match. And and Byzantine art is long before your medieval period. Now there's even one that I saw, and I don't have a picture of it, but it showed Jesus on the shroud because it was folded. There's a crease across the neck where it was folded. You can see it even on this imagery. See on the face and just below the beard on the chin, you see a crease, a line going across there. That line was even painted in the 300s, some of the Byzantine art, 300s and 400s of Jesus. You see that same line painted across. It was giving, I don't know if you'd call it homage, but it was making strong reference to this is Jesus because it's the same image that was on the shroud, and the crease was already in there. So that's, I thought, very, very interesting. It's also quite obvious that one shoulder is dislocated. Yeah, there were dislocated shoulders here. So that tells you something. Now, people say, well, his arms are awfully long to be covering his genitals like that, if you look at the imagery. And I always thought it looked awkward until you realized that they were showing Jesus, or they're showing this body's being shown. How do I want to say this? They did a 3D rendering, measurements of all of how the body and how it would sit that way with the hands covering the genitals. Is that if they crossed the hands in front of him, and his body would have been, in a sense, almost doubled over, but not quite. And that's from the constriction of the body. The rigor mortis is setting in, and it's all the damage that had been done to his body. He was in this position where he's, in a sense, a little bit crouched. And you just take your hands, crouch just a little bit, a couple of inches, and you'll find your hands will cover your crotch when you cross your wrists like that. So, and now there's another very interesting thing, and I was going to save this for a little bit later in describing this. But did you know that some of the new imagery, the Turin Shroud hands region analysis, shows a thumb point that it looks like the hand is just doing this, if you look at me on the screen. But there's a little bit of a thumb. You see my thumb now coming out like that? It's because the hand is doing this. The hand is constricted from having had the nails put through the wrists. And you do that, and it takes a hand, and it constricts the hand like this. So when he's hanging, his hands would have been kind of like this. And so what you're seeing on the shroud, you're seeing the hand like that with the thumb constricted, but just a tip of it sticking out. And you can see it even on the shroud. You can see that when we get pictures of the hands. But what's very interesting, and I'll bet you didn't know this, and Niall, have you heard of this? Because I know you've studied this before. The shroud hands, just below the hands, it reveals a scrotum. There is part of the scrotum showing. And the reason that was such a big deal was they were saying this is definitely a man that's on here, because right below his crossed hands, now that they've been able to do this more, I wish I knew what it was called. I did not put it in my notes. The imagery that they're doing now, they're able to pick up all this finer detail in the image on the shroud. And they're finding that there's a scrotum there down below the hands, which I find that very interesting. So now let's go back to our 7 reasons. So we've got so far, what do we got? Wrapped in a sheet, crown of thorns, carrying a cross, use of nails, the unbroken legs with the stabbed wound in the side, and 6, no washing or anointing. Now, both the man on the shroud and Jesus in the story were wrapped in a funerary shroud immediately after being taken down from the cross, without any washing or anointing taking place. Instead, normal burial customs, including washing the body and anointing it with aromatic oils before wrapping it in the cloth, did not take place. In Jesus' case, we know that he was wrapped in a sheet, placed in a tomb immediately after he was taken down from the cross, and they were required to complete this operation before nightfall, when the Jewish Passover began, during which they couldn't perform manual labor. So women carried out the final burial 2 days later. So here's what you got going on. Jesus taken down from the cross late on Friday. And now, what starts the Sabbath? Sabbath goes from evening to morning. So at sundown on the Sabbath, on Friday, is the beginning of the Sabbath. What is supposed to, by Jewish law, you cannot anoint a body, you cannot cleanse a body, you cannot do anything. They had to rush to get him in the tomb. And then they had the Sabbath, which lasted from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. So in the morning on Sunday, the women were going to come and anoint the body, wash and anoint the body. Niall says, and I'm referring a lot to Niall here because I love his knowledge of this. He says, just for the audience, all the vertical black marks are burn marks. Oh yeah, those big wild shaped, like triangular shaped and the big long marks going down both sides of the shroud. That's when it was folded up. The corners and edges got burned. And the thing was almost 3 times almost burned. And it was burned. I mean, almost burned up. Those are burn marks. As the shroud is 13 feet long, it was folded down extensively, and then the fire almost took it out. So, yeah, that's what all those markings are, going vertically up and down the shroud. Okay, let's go back to our 7 points here. So that was number 6 about the no washing or anointing. So both Jesus and whoever is on the shroud were not washed. And there was still blood and everything. Now 7, he remained in the sheet for a very short time. So both the man on the shroud and Jesus remained in the sheet for a short amount of time. In the case of the man on the shroud, to obtain the image we see, it was necessary for the corpse to remain on the sheet for a few hours, but no more than 2 or 3 days. Why? The decomposition process would have destroyed the image on the linen, and it would have left simple stains on the fabric, which the shroud doesn't depict. There would have been just simple blood stains and decomposing flesh stains, but you would not have any detail at all. And similarly, Jesus was wrapped in this linen shroud after being taken down from the cross, and he remained wrapped for probably not much more than 40 hours, 36 to 40 hours. Now, they say that, he was in the tomb for 3 days and rose again 3 days later. Well, in the Jewish way of reckoning things, part of Friday, all day Saturday, part of Sunday was 3 days. So the probability that these 7 things we've just talked about occurred simultaneously in another man who underwent the torture of crucifixion is 1 in 20 billion. I don't know how they came up with that number, but it's very high. And that's a quote. And it's, in other words, out of 20 billion possible crucified people, only 1 could have possessed the 7 characteristics that we've considered here, common to the man of the shroud and to Jesus at the same time. So as is evident in the history of humanity, there couldn't have been 20 billion crucifixions, and at most a few 100,000 or a few million, maybe, if you include the crucifying all of Spartacus's men down the Appian Way a few decades earlier. But the calculation carried out allows us to conclude that the probability that a crucified person with the same characteristics as the story of Jesus is unique and very high, and therefore the image on the shroud is that of Jesus himself. Oh, look at that. We've already gone off on the radio. I wasn't even paying attention to time. Sorry, radio audience, if you've joined us, I just trailed off on the audio in the radio station. I was not looking at the clock at all, and I can't believe we've already been going an hour. So it's really time for the captain's cabin, but we can go on just a little bit without even jumping into the captain's cabin, because I find this stuff just absolutely fascinating. Niles says, there's no way this is not the body of Christ. In modern terms, a forensic pathologist in a courtroom would have to agree. And that's the thing about the evidence. You would have to agree that this is the face of Christ. This is the body of Christ that made this. Now, they've gone through all kinds of things to try to prove it was a painting, that it was pigment. We talked about this the other day. They have found that pigment, and again, I don't have the numbers on this one because that wasn't my focus for tonight, but for pigment or paint to adhere to the linen, just this scientific fact all by itself tells you something. For that pigment, if somebody painted this image, to adhere to fiber This kind of fiber, especially, it has to be. Now, I'm not making these numbers up. I'm approximating it because I don't remember the exact depths, but it takes something like 12 to 14 microns deep for pigment to adhere to this fiber. Do you know how deep the image is on the fiber? It's only 6 or 7. It's about half the amount needed for pigment to stick. So you got, there it is, Radio Gaga, Radio Goo Goo. Yeah, that's the stuff. Some kind of radio blah, 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 radioactive stuff. But the pigment could not be pigment. The image could not be pigment because pigment needs a certain number of microns to adhere to fabric. And there's not even half the amount in depth for it to stick. So there you go. By the way, this image right here shows you also that fold across the, it's really the neck area of the image of Jesus on the shroud. Now, I've got other things here, and I want to, there's so much here. The Turin shroud is traditionally considered the burial cloth of Jesus, but carbon-14 analysis indicated a medieval date, and there's a digital restoring of the hands region of the Turin shroud image was allowed to visualize anatomical details never seen before. The scrotum, part of the right hand's thumb, additionally the unnatural position of the right hand's thumb, adjacent to the palm of the hand, positioned below it, and consequently almost fully hidden except for it's just the tip protruding from behind the hand, seems to denote a stress on the hand, which could be consequent to crucifixion. These results shed new light on the long-lasting scientific debate about the authenticity of the relic, since the absence of the thumbs had been considered as one of the most important indirect proof that the Turin shroud wrapped the body of a man who was crucified alive. Now, as far as that carbon dating issue again, that has all been redone, and it's been redone extensively. And one of the things that is taken into consideration here is that the Shroud of Turin is the Shroud of Turin is one of the most examined archaeological artifacts in the history of archaeology. It has been so looked at. And for them to screw up the carbon dating like that the first time and then correct it because they wanted to make double sure they knew what they were doing. And the church allowed them to do that. Why do you suppose they allowed them to do that? Because this is a relic. It's something they put their belief in. And they say, we can believe in this by faith, but we want the world to know what we believe. And so they allowed them to take more of that. Wouldn't have seen it if you don't believe it. What's that? You wouldn't have seen it if you didn't believe it. I wouldn't have seen it if I didn't believe it. What, the thumb tip? I think they were looking for stuff, and you can see it. I saw it in the pictures. You can see that tip of the thumb that's there. And I'm not sure if I even have the picture still up somewhere, and why I got rid of that, I don't know. Why I didn't save that picture, because I was looking at that thumb, and also, frankly, the scrotum. You could see the scrotum. These are also this Radio Goo Goo, Radio Gaga that Rapid Dog is talking about. What they have used to see deeper into the image on the shroud has also revealed the things we talked about the other night. That on the wrists, he's still got the black leather prayer. What do they call that in Judaism? The strap that they wrap around their wrist for prayer. And they hold into the palm of their hand. That strap is still on the body. And remember, they arrested Jesus. What was he doing when they arrested him? praying in the garden. And so he had that strap on his arm. They're seeing things like that. There was a little chain, like a little delicate necklace type of a chain that was on the body that it looks like it was broken, but it was either around his neck or around his wrist or something, but it was broken and it was laying partially crumpled to the side. And they don't know if the body was wearing it or somebody placed it there. But it would have had to have been placed there. It was Jesus before they wrapped him in the shroud. So little details like that are being seen on the shroud. And this thing is going to take a whole lot longer examination and me presenting a whole lot more information. But there is, I looked at an interview. I heard this going on Glenn Beck's show the other day. Might have been this morning, might have been yesterday. And Glenn Beck was talking to a guy named Jeremiah J. Johnson. There's your true J. Jonah Jameson, your JJJ. He was a Baptist pastor who went from a Shroud of Turin skeptic to a defender. And he's in the process of getting published a new book on the Shroud. He's the one who wrote the book. I've got it here. Something proof. Let me see what it is here. Come on, open up. It's called Body of Proof, and that's his book on the resurrection of Jesus. But in the Body of Proof, he mentions the shroud, but now he's specifically writing about the shroud. A book on the shroud, because he believes it's something that Christians and believers and non-believers ought to know, is that this image is the image of Christ according to him. And he's got his reasons for believing this. And let's see what he says here in his foreword. This is his foreword to Body of Proof. Or the foreword that was written, I'm sorry. As Dr. Jeremiah Johnson notes at the outset of his book, too seldom are there series of sermons or Bible studies on the resurrection of Jesus. Yet this event is unquestionably at the very center of the New Testament proclamation. Paul stated that apart from this event, the very faith of his hearers was vain and they were all still in their sin. So often do believers today hear such words as these. And so the subject of Jesus' resurrection, which is what Jeremiah Johnson wrote about in his first book, occupies more than 300 verses in the canonical New Testament. And these texts typically describe either the historical testimony and the facticity of this event, or it's being the very center of the gospel message of the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But while the gospel teaching the apologetic significance of this message are probably the most common applications of this occurrence. And this is what you have with the talking about the resurrection. And it's connected to almost every major theological doctrine, as well as many, if not most, areas of the practical application and the practice of the Christian faith. So I wanted to pull some information from his book, Body of Proof, but I left off on that in lieu of getting deeper into examination of the shroud itself. But I wanted to look at this interview that Johnson did with Glenn Beck. And he says, is there enough evidence? Do you think, let me ask you guys all this. Is there enough evidence to prove that the Shroud of Turin is real? That's the big question. This pastor, Jeremiah Johnson, used to be a skeptic. But once he did a deep dive into the history of the Shroud, he became an absolute total defender of the Shroud's authenticity. And So Glenn had done an interview with this guy, and he laid it all out from a scientific perspective. And he, of course, has written a book about it. The shroud, he says, is truly the burial cloth of Jesus. This isn't just, now don't worry about me saying this way. This isn't just a Catholic thing. It's not just for Catholics anymore. A belief that the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus. It's not just a Catholic thing. And here, let me get back to, I've lost where my window is for the show. There we go. I'm going to take this image down, even though we're talking about this. Sean says, I didn't know what a Baptist church apologetic pastor was. Enough evidence that Jesus was real and he was crucified. Yeah, something like that. And he's an apologist, meaning obviously writing in defense of something. And so he goes on, and he wrote this book, Body of Proof, and is now writing his book on the shroud, or I think it's been written. It's just in the process of being published. And remember doubting Thomas in the Bible after Jesus' resurrection? In the book of John, the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 25, he basically says, Thomas says, one of the disciples, he said, hey, you know what? Look, you can say Jesus is God. Good for you. But unless I see his nail-scarred hands, unless I can put my hand in his side where he was stabbed with the spear, I'm not going to believe it. And what's interesting on the shroud is that you can actually see the nail-pierced hands, and you can see the spear-pierced side. Now, those two things all by themselves don't make the image on the shroud Jesus. It's the culmination of all the other bits of evidence and comparative bits of evidence that I think brings about the conclusion that this is Jesus on the shroud. You got Barry Schwartz, who was the first photographer with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. A scientific laboratory was called in, not a religious one, to Italy to see the Shroud of Turin in 1978. Barry Schwartz was the photographer. And he said, hey, and he's Jewish. He said, hey, free trip to Italy? That's what we all felt. Let's go look at this thing. Let's see what we come up with. And we'll prove it's a fake and free trip to Italy. And he said, and I mentioned this the other night, Barry Schwartz has said many times, he said, one thing I could tell you was that in the first 10 minutes I was with that shroud, I could tell you it was not a fake. It was not painted. It was not, and he gave all his reasons, and he's been doing this ever since 1978 now. And he's still Jewish, but he's now a believer. He says, I don't know what to do with the whole Messiah thing. He says, but I'll tell you this, whatever made that image on the shroud isn't normal. It isn't natural. It's not the common result of decaying gases that some have said, well, images can get left on cloth from decaying bodies. Yeah, but not detailed photographic images. There's lots of reasons things can happen, but the only way that image showed up the way it does and the more detail they're finding, I shy away from using the word miraculous, but it's not normal and it's not natural. And so Barry Schwartz said, I can't tell you if this is the savior of mankind, the kinsman redeemer, the Messiah. He says, but what I can tell you is that I believe that this is Jesus of Nazareth. Which is very interesting. He's keeping something close to the vest on that. So, when the body came back to life, It's like the burial cloth was like a film. It printed it in a burst. Would it be light? A burst of light? It printed the negative of his body. That's what you get when you rush the word negative with body. Negative. It was the negative of his body in that cloth. Something about, we say that we believe in the supernatural and the paranormal and the extraordinary, that we believe in all those things. Or at least we tacitly believe them. We're looking for proof. This is a supernatural event. Something weird and supernatural left that image on the shroud. Rapid Dog says acidic sweat from being in shock stained the cloth. See, no offense to you, but that's bullshit. That's not what happened. It wasn't acidic sweat. Come on. Even you know that, I think. That's just one of the arguments that's presented. Maybe that's what you're trying to tell us, Rapid. It's not acidic sweat. Do you think that these guys that have been studying this for 40 years didn't ask that same question and research that to the bitter end to see if that might be what it was? No, it wasn't sweat. It wasn't decaying body. It was nothing like that. It's very different. Let's see. Nobody really knows how the image was made. All we know is that the things that have been described, like Rapid, what you just said, the acidic sweat, people just know that that's not, they know by the research, that's not how it happened. Nothing that can be naturally explained explains the image on the shroud. That's why we're left with the conclusions we've come up with. So we got people that doubt. Well, now, like doubting Thomas, what happened when Thomas said that to the disciples, other disciples? Unless I see the nail prints in his hands and feet, and I put my hand in the spear thrust in his side, I'm not going to believe this. It's impossible. It's a bunch of crap. And he's saying, what happens? Next moment, Jesus appears in the room. It's Thomas. Hey, I'm here. It's me. Look, you can put your finger in the nail prints in my hands. Wrist was part of the hand. You can put your hand in the spear thrust in my side. Now, did he take those wounds forever, for all eternity? Is Jesus going to have those wounds? I don't know. Did he have them to make that proof point to his disciples? Yeah, I think so. That's my theory. We have to situate this whole thing about the shroud because there's some really important points here. There's been a pejorative vibe toward the shroud by anyone who isn't Catholic. And I want to remind you all that the Catholic Church, they're the largest landowners on church. And did you know that? The Catholic Church are the largest landowners. Did you know that they actually have a lot of land? They have a lot of assets. They have a lot of property. And guess what? It turns out that they have some excellent artifacts for the Christian faith. Because of all that property ownership. C.S. Lewis. We've all heard of C.S. Lewis. Chronicles of Narnia fame and all of that. Something about C.S. Lewis here. At Lewis's home, I'm reading his account here, what he said, and so I'm skipping a lot of irrelevant stuff in this. He says, I look up and C.S. Lewis kept a picture of the Shroud of Turin in his bedroom, and it was next to his bed where he slept. And the reason he did that Lewis said, was I needed a reminder every morning and every evening that my God has a face. And so we're not talking about something weird or friseur, or even C.S. Lewis took it seriously. Now, that's not the kind of evidence I need to hear to believe something if I'm a skeptic. But I know I have said many times, it seems we worship a nameless, faceless God. We don't know what he looks like. We don't know who he is. Maybe we do with the shroud. What's remarkable about the Shroud of Turin is it goes back far beyond radiocarbon dating. Oh, and by the way, Rapid Dog, if I didn't make it clear, I'm not saying you were full of bullshit. I'm saying that argument that you're probably just mimicking, the argument itself is what's bullshit. So I think there's too much around it to make that bullshit. So, not you. No offense to you personally, by the way. Don't appropriate the offense. It wasn't intended to make you feel offended. So, what's remarkable about the shroud, that it goes far beyond the original radiocarbon dating. Some of the people hear shroud and they're like, "What's that?" And as when you think about it, it's the burial garment for Jesus. All four Gospels say that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, two members of the Jewish Sanhedrin. Remember, if the Sanhedrin condemned a criminal to death, it was according to the Mishnah. And the Sanhedrin had to bury the condemned criminal. So what do we see in the judicial procedure of Jesus? Two members, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. They're the ones that take Jesus. They wrap his body in a burial garment. They bury him in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. Joseph said to Pilate, I've got a tomb that we can put him in. Can we have the body, please? It wasn't even Jesus' disciples that put him in the tomb. It was Joseph of Arimathea. So you got two members of the Sanhedrin and Nicodemus who put Jesus in the tomb. Telling everybody that the women are going to have to come back and prep his body. So they put the body in the tomb, and then where the head is, they took and they pulled back the rest of the fabric down to his feet. So it's a double image of the back and then a space for the top of the head and then the front of his body. And that's not unusual. If you were in the Jewish burial tradition, you'd do that. You might say, that's a tradition that they followed. There's no way that a burial shroud could last for 2,000 years, some people might say. And I say, well, actually, when you're a student of history, you can see that we even have a Tarkan dress linen shirt. Guess what? It's 3,200 years older than the Shroud of Turin. It's 5,000 years old. So given the right set of circumstances, linen's going to last forever. So, and if it's got a decaying body on it, it's not going to last. It's 14 feet long, 13 and a half, something like that. It's about 4 feet wide. It's longer than our studio table right here. And what's fascinating is something occurred on that shroud. And there are some pretty amazing reasons about what happened. This guy, Jeremiah Johnson, says, there's top 5 reasons I have why I went from skeptic. And looking for the way he lists his reasons here. He says, here's a countdown of reasons. The Shroud of Turin is the most studied artifact of the archaeological world. There's not a close second. Now, consider that for a second. Almost as old as my underwear, says Rapid Dog. Yeah, that's why I don't wear any anymore. They've all decayed off of my decaying body. That's a joke, kind of. So, what you've got is an artifact. Think of all the archaeology that's done and how they go back and forth until they reach a final conclusion on something. No archaeological artifact has been studied as much as the Shroud of Turin. And are they still getting it wrong? Well, they've ruled out a lot of things that were wrong, however. So that's the first thing. The second thing, it's the most lied about artifact in the archaeological world. So when it comes to the archaeological world, it's the most researched and studied, and it is the most lied about. Why is that? I think it's because it involves something that deals with religion and spirituality. There's been an amazing evidential history of the Shroud of Turin. 1978 is when the Shroud of Turin research product team came and with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. They went to Italy. They thought it would be a free trip to Italy. They were all having drinks in the lobby, so attests Barry Schwartz of the hotel, giggling that on the Catholic Church, they're there on the Catholic Church's dime, and they'd have a free trip to Italy. They only had 2 days to prove that it was a hoax. And guess what? Nobody was giggling 2 days later out of that team. And that's at the very beginning of all of this study. They had approximately, in all, 120 hours to examine this very ancient shroud, which has a very unique history. Hitler even tried to steal it during World War II. They had to save it from Hitler's hands during the war. The history of the shroud is remarkable. So these weren't biblical scholars that were doing this in 1978. They were outside of the priests that took care of the shroud, that were kind of the security overlooking the shroud while it was being looked at. And these were all weapons scientists. Barry Schwartz, who you know, who I've interviewed before. Go back and look at his website again, shroud.com. 40 years of compiling evidence. He was a nominal Jew at the time, and his only bias was he thought it was a hoax and a joke when he went there. And he's now utterly convinced that not only is it not a hoax, because, and we'll be talking about this more throughout the evening here, if it's a hoax, it's never been repeated. He's convinced that it's an authentic burial shroud of Jesus. So it's the most studied cross-disciplinary practice in the world. And in the 1970s, Barry and all the others from the JPL laboratory, they all went into skeptics. But the radiocarbon dating was saying it's like 1,000 years old, and that's it. In 1978, you have the original research project, and they come out, and what they say is it's not a hoax. There's no pigment. There's no ink. There's no dye. The shroud has survived 3 fires. It's been doused in water twice. And if there was dye, if there was paint, it would have bled out. It would have been smeared. So essentially, this team from JPL, they came out and said, it's not a hoax. We don't know what it is. 10 years later, 1988, this is the point number 3 in this countdown of 5 things. 1988 carbon dating was done. So about 10 years after that, original research project. And this is when all the headlines came out in 1988 that said, this is a total hoax, the Shroud of Turin. Carbon-14 dating, dated it to the late 13th, early 14th century. There you go, the 1200s to the 1300s. And there's huge problems with that. The fourth thing is science today. This is what really arrests my attention. It can't explain how the image is in the cloth. By today's standards of science, you cannot. If it's acid etched, do you think that science could explain that? They can't. That's been ruled out, Rapid. Sean says, Kitten Felix likes to watch you too, Scotty Roberts. Is that like your date tonight, Sean? Kitten Felix? Kitten, meow. So he goes on. Let's see. I want to see what else he has to say about it. It's under a vault. They bring it out every few years. It's that same cathedral in Piedmont district of northern Italy. As you say, in Turin. If you go to Jerusalem, there's an incredible shroud exhibit there that shows every aspect of the shroud. I think there's one in Texas, too. A reproduction of the shroud. Rocket scientists were on this team. Republican scientists, chemical scientists. They can't explain to this very day how the image was made on the shroud. And Rapid, if you go acid etched, oh, they forgot that one. No, they've gone through it all. It doesn't explain it because that acid etching can't make that image appear. I mean, that's what's unbelievable. These aren't Bible theologians or commentators. They're scientists saying we can't explain how there's an image there. And here's the fascinating thing. Do you know if you get closer than 8 feet, the image kind of vanishes? You actually have to stand back from it about 8 feet to be able to see the image. It's very unique. I think that's just because of the shade of the image. Again, let me throw this image up. Here is the here's the image of the shroud again. It's going to appear small on your screen, sorry. But you see on the bottom, the really dark marks are the burn marks from where it was folded. That's why you get these like repeating patterns in it. It was all folded up and the edges were burned. But look for the lighter mark going right down from side to side, right down the middle line of that lighter image. And you can see right in the middle toward the right, you see the head going to the chest, the crossed hands, and the legs. And then the left side is his back. And you can see all the lash marks. If you look up at the one up on the top, you can see all the white marks all up and down his back and his legs and his chest. These are all the lashings from a flagrum. Makes those kinds of marks. So, interesting. I've got something else I was going to get into tonight. And we're already been going an hour and a half on this. We're through half of the captain's cabin already. This is an image I created for that book for the author on the timeline of the final hours of Jesus. I'm just going to go through this a little bit. It goes from Thursday to Friday to Saturday to Sunday. And I don't think I need to get into this too deeply. I was going to bring that up because I also had wanted to go through the 10 concise pieces of evidence for the resurrection. Let's hit these really quick and we'll kind of wrap with this today. Now, these are the kinds of evidences that are faith-based evidences. I don't think they're taken from an incredibly detached point of view. But I feel I would be remiss in not adding this to our examination of this whole issue of the shroud. So I've got 10 concise pieces of evidence for the resurrection. And this is for your consideration. And this is a concise statement of the pieces of evidence for the real, true, historical resurrection of Jesus, the Messiah. Now, even that statement alone belies his position. This is what he believes. So, number one, there are 4 ancient biographies of Jesus. He's talking about the Gospels. Actually, there's 70. There's only 4 that are in canonical scripture. They're all written by eyewitnesses and are based on eyewitness testimony. Now, he's looking at this as if this were being presented in a court of law. We've got 4 eyewitness testimonies about the life of this guy. They were written and circulated while many other eyewitnesses were still alive. These biographies all say that Jesus rose from the dead. These biographies are supplemented by letters written by eyewitnesses while many other witnesses were still alive. These ancient letters claim that Jesus died by crucifixion and that on the 3rd day rose from the dead. Yeah, the woke but not awake. Exactly, Sean. So, if you took this to a court of law as evidence, you got books that were written, you got subsequent letters and books, which are all throughout the New Testament, written about the same topic. Those people were eyewitnesses. Well, of course, your skeptic is going to say, or your detractor, or your denialist is going to say, well, we don't know what all the sources of those books were. We don't have the original copies. No, but you got how many of them? How many books in the New Testament? And they're all fake, according to these denialists? Well, we can't trust them because we don't have the source material. They still all say the same thing. So this is court of law types of evidence. Now it goes on. Number 2, pagan and Jewish writers report that Christians believed Jesus rose from the dead. Both pagans and Jewish writers report this. Roman writers reported this. Number 3, many of the principal eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus died because of their claim that Jesus was resurrected. Their lives would probably have been spared if they had recanted. And this is a very significant point, by the way. We know that if people will die for a cause, but these people, these men and women, died for a set of facts. They went to their grave rather than say that the facts were untrue. They died because they said the facts of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus were true. Think of that for a while. Nobody dies for a lie. Exactly, Sean. Number 4, the eyewitness's story told by John is very important. The Gospel of John. Many people today will claim that John's story, like the other eyewitness stories, is meant to be understood as a story of symbol and metaphor. But we know that John clearly understood the difference between telling an historical story and telling a story overflowing with symbol and metaphor. Why? Because he wrote 2 books. One that very clearly claims to be the historical, known as the Gospel of John, and one that is clearly all about symbol and metaphor, that we know as the book of Revelation. So John is an important witness of what happened in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And what he was writing about Jesus was not symbolic. It was not metaphoric. Because you can compare what his account is about Jesus and his account that is metaphor and symbolism in the book of Revelation. That's a big point. Number 5, the historical evidence shows that the grave was empty. The grave clothes were neatly left behind. The stone enclosing the tomb. And by the way, it wasn't the disciples who folded up the sudarium that covered his face. This cloth, remember this cloth? We talked about that very early in the program. This is the cloth that was found separate from the Shroud of Turin and is considered to be the face cloth that was wrapped around Jesus after the crucifixion. Well, people will say, well, there's no mention of a face cloth. Yeah, there is. Remember, it said that when they came into the tomb, the disciples came into the tomb, they saw the grave clothes empty, and the cloth, the sudarium, folded up alongside. And it was folded, meaning somebody got up and went, I'm going to fold that up. And the sudarium here that you're looking at, the blood stain and the blood stain patterns match the blood stain patterns on the Shroud of Turin. But the blood stain patterns on the shroud aren't as copious as the stains on this one. This was the cloth that was directly on the face, and the shroud was laid over that. So it only got secondary bleed through. But they match up. How about that? There's more. But wait, there's more. So the grave was empty. Grave clothes were neatly left behind. The stone enclosing the tomb was rolled away. The body of Jesus was never found. The grave had been guarded by Roman soldiers. No one even claimed to have stolen the body. The presence of the grave clothes are significant. It was the spices attached to the cloth that had value. Anyone removing the body for profit or mischief would have taken the wrapped body away and separated out the valuable mixture at their leisure. In fact, the placement of the grave clothes, like the placement of the stone, perfectly fits with the resurrection as the cause rather than with human agency as the cause. It's the resurrection. Number 6, there are, not counting the Apostle Paul and the books he wrote, 11 recorded times that Jesus appeared to people, proving that he was resurrected. These appearances were to men and women, individuals, couples, groups, and at least one crowd. And the appearances were inside, outside, in different locations, and at different times of the day. He was physically touched. He was audibly heard, visually seen, and he ate food in the presence of witnesses. None of these witnesses believed that Jesus would rise from the dead before he rose from the dead. And all of them knew him before his death. So they knew he was the same Jesus who they had just seen die on the cross a few days earlier. Now, you could say all of this testimony is from people within an account that was written by somebody that we can't prove it was a real book. Well, we can prove it's a real book. Can't prove the source material. The shroud, says Niall, is the ultimate taboo. So much evidence for science to consider, colliding faith. Oh, my. We can't go there. Yeah, that's very true, isn't it? And Niall, if you're, I don't know if you called in, Captain Barbados called in. Oh, I see Matthew is there. Matthew, hang on, okay? Let me get through this material and I'll bring you in. I just want to get through these last few points. So if you hold on there, I haven't seen you for a while. So it'll be nice to have you on. Let's see. We were on point number 6. Everybody who saw Jesus after his death knew him before he died. Number 7 out of 10. In the very place where Jesus died and was buried, there was an explosion of growth in the Christian movement, which was centered on the claim that the grave was empty and that Jesus had truly risen. And this explosion of growth happened mere weeks after the death and resurrection of Jesus in the place where he died. The growth happened in the face of hostility, opposition, persecution from civil and religious leaders. Number 8, the death and the resurrection of Jesus wasn't a random event. Jesus predicted that he would die by crucifixion. Now, of course, your skeptics are going to say this was all written after the fact, and it was all written to make Jesus look this way. The body, they stole the body and said the grave was empty. He rose from the dead because they wanted to prove that Jesus. Why would you do that? is the big question, when they were afraid to even be there to bury him in the first place. His prediction, Jesus' prediction, that he would die from crucifixion is very significant. He couldn't control that. He couldn't control that at all. Crucifixion was a means of death reserved to the imperial Roman authorities. Jesus claimed reasonably that his death by crucifixion and his resurrection on the third day would be a sign that vindicated who he was, what he thought, what he would accomplish by his death and his resurrection. Number 9, the death and resurrection of Jesus also took place in the context of centuries of prophecy that such a Messiah would come from God and die and rise. Jesus himself claimed that his life and his death and resurrection was a fulfillment of those prophecies. Then number 10, there's more. The death and resurrection of Jesus takes place in the context of an overarching story that has deep and powerful insights into the human condition. His life, his death, his resurrection took place in the context of a body of writings that have proved for millennia to be wise and insightful about the human condition. These writings have been the basis for the development of science, human rights, good government. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus took place in the context of a worldview that is unsurpassed in its breadth, its depth, its coherence, its consistency, and its emotional and rational power. Consider Jesus, crucified, risen Savior, loving Lord, is somebody that has evidentiary proof that he rose from the dead, at least evidence that would stand up in court of law. It might not stand up enough to convince people that it's true, that the whole thing isn't true, but it's enough to stand up to say, if under the rules of evidence, this would suffice. So there you go. There is, and there's so much more. That's the thing about all of this. There is so much more to all of this. Who is this? Who is that face? And here is the reconstruction of that face by an artist. Boom. And then, of course, my own. I did off of the shroud right there. So, you guys, you have to make a choice. Make up your mind. Who do you think that is? All right, I'm going to add Matthew Sainsbury. Good to see you, brother. I haven't seen you for a long time.
Thanks, Scotty. Yeah, I wasn't too well recently. Had a bit of a fever, so at least I overcome that. So
sound was off. There we go.
A lot of stuff going around now since COVID. Masks are not being worn anymore, so the virus is going around. Yeah.
Nice. Not cool.
The interesting thing, though, is that I was watching a documentary on this all afternoon.
Yeah.
The Shroud. Yeah, because it's really true. My father, that he told me that he believes that the reason why that image is on the cloth to this day is the power of the resurrection. Some burst of energy or something created that type of negative there on the cloth itself. I learned that from him. So, yeah.
Interesting. By the way, I was a little distracted. We've got Rapid Dog made up, but still true. You should call in, Rapid Dog. I want you to tell us give us your information. You said people take their deaths for multiple reasons.
Yeah, you shared something interesting too. They said that just below where the palm of the hand is, by the finger, and so you can actually see the testicles, or so it shows you that he was crucified naked. Yeah, that definitely show that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because in Christian artwork, you usually see like a loincloth.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. That shows that he was crucified naked.
Yeah. And, if they're on the shroud, if that's truly Jesus and you're seeing a scrotum on the shroud, that tells you something too.
There's a man called
point of interest.
Yeah, because there's a man called Dominic Crossman. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He's a theologian as well
Not off
too.
the top.
He would be in the field of Bar Earthman and people like that, and he wanted to say that there's this thing can't be fake. He believes that there's something genuine about it, because he said that if this thing had actually dated from 1350, somebody would have to crucify someone or something to create an image like that. So he believes that even he himself, being a skeptic in certain aspects, believes that the shroud has some authenticity to it. Doesn't believe it's just make believe. So
Yes.
because
By
even
the
the
way,
talking
Colleen
head,
Deary is a friend of mine from my church I used to attend years ago. I talk about my old friend Parson Larson. He was our pastor. Colleen was a member of the church. She says, I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, put in prison. They wouldn't have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep a lie for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep a lie for 40 years? Absolutely. So that is a very interesting point, Colleen. Thank you for bringing that point up. That's a good point to make. Niall,
and
you're here too.
Yeah.
And
Amen.
sorry, Matthew, hang on a second. Captain Barbados, I've named him because he is calling from Barbados. We
Oh,
have
wow.
Niall from Ireland. We have
I
an
wish-
international board here tonight.
Good evening, Niall.
Good evening, Captain Barbados. I wish I was in Barbados at the moment. Yeah, it sounds
wouldn't
like
that be nice?
Nice place to live. I might have a cocktail at this hour of the night.
Yeah.
I spoke a lot in the chat room about the shroud, and it's very interesting because it is the ultimate taboo. Because the evidence for the shroud being authentic is so overwhelming, according to Scripture, that if it was presented in a court of law, as an example of somebody who was murdered and they were wrapped in a shroud, and where was the wound, and what happened, and when did it occur, and it just ticks all the boxes. Everything's there. So if this is a forgery, it's just like incredibly impossible.
Well, and that's the thing.
It would take like hundreds of people to hang on a minute. How do we fake this and how do we fake that? Even coming down to the one big point of contention about the shroud's origins are, why is Christ's hair where he is? Why is his hair like mine? It's kind of like this. If you're lying back, it would fall down, right?
It would fall down. And
now, if you look at the back of the shroud, you can see that you can just see the back of his head. You can't see the hair at the sides. So his hair was raised up. His head was raised up. He was lying on either two stones or some kind of hollow block, which raised the hair. A bit. Yeah, and what proves that is the back of the shroud, because you can just see one strip down the back of his head. You can't see the hair at the sides. So therefore, the hair at the sides, at the back, was contained at the front. And that was one big argument that people always said, why is his hair there? Because it would fall back, because it was raised. So I do believe that the head was propped up on whether it was two stones or some kind of block.
Something too that we talked about earlier on, and you were here, so you heard this, but it's the whole tenting thing. When that shroud was across his face and his hair, he's laying on his back, but it's tented over his face like that. So it's picking up hair that's pushed up because he's laying on it, for one, and then it's also tented, so it's you're not seeing it two-dimensionally, you're seeing a three-dimensional tenting. So it's picking up it's almost like a wrapped image. So you're seeing what looks like more hair there is because the image is being picked up and then it's in the tenting and then it's spread out. So
possibly, but
yeah.
that would also kind of make the face kind of distorted. What I think makes more sense from a logical point of view is that his head was propped up in some way, including his hair.
Yes,
and I think I think that's kind of proved by the back of the shroud, because his hair, if he was lying flat, his hair would be flayed out.
Yeah.
You would see the blood. You would see probably a lot more blood at the back of his head, but you don't. So I think his head was propped up between two stones,
they show that his body was constricted as well, which I mentioned.
Yes.
He wasn't laying flat. He was hunched, and he was there was rigor setting in from that.
Yeah. And the reason I describe it as a taboo is because science has a big problem with the Shroud of Turin, because everything points to like, oh my God, this is. Everything just slots into place, from the dislocated shoulder to the position of the hands, there were very, very clever artists back in the day who could possibly duplicate that. But you would also need an entire team of people around you who would try and cover every little detail, so people like you and me would be fooled.
Yes.
So it's just not possible. And also the excretions. Let's talk about the excretions on the Turin Shroud. Now, scientifically, it is possible that extreme terror and extreme trauma can produce, through adrenaline and the excretions of sweat and blood and fear and adrenaline, a stain, right? Now, probably nothing like that, but that's where you
nothing that detailed,
yeah. But that's where faith meets science. Okay, you have to say, well, my way of looking at it, if Jesus was to make a statement about his crucifixion and the agony that he went through, well, chances are that would be a way to do it, and so he it's not like he's lying there like screaming and all curled up.
Yeah, not screaming, man.
But you can understand that those fibers were barely gone into.
Like I say, half the micron depth that was necessary to leave pigment on fabric.
Yeah, so
that would include rotting flesh or acids.
Absolutely, and everything lines up, including the small shroud that his face is covered in, which I believe was probably wiped across his nose and mouth.
Yes,
which would make sense given
and
the
it shows the image on the shroud that he had his skin was split open across the bridge of his nose.
Across the bridge of his nose.
Yeah, they beat this man
all kinds of blood coming out from that.
Yeah. So that would
explain.
That's
not mentioned as, why don't they mention that? Well, they said he was beaten. So he's got his nose was split.
Yeah.
Not broken, but split.
Yeah. So. I think, as a man, as a human being, what he went through with his torture and the flailing and the whipping of his flesh, the agony, the blood and everything that was contained within his essence was probably. This is the faith side of me thinking, was contained within that shroud. Because why? For us to see. Why is it taboo? Because science cannot make sense of it. Because
Rapid Dog asks, why would anybody want it to not be true? What is your take on that? Why do you think people would not want this to be true? Even why would they resist the evidence and say, well, it's still not true?
Well, because there'll be a lot of pushback from, depending on the denomination of faith that you come from. If we were to say this was Christ, right? And
right.
there's stuff on this shroud we can't explain, but the stuff on this shroud we can explain, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yep.
a taboo. That's a taboo right there.
Yes.
That's like, wow, we can't go there because that's why science is scared shitless of this shroud, because there's so much that makes sense about it, and anatomically it makes sense. Every little detail, from the dislocated shoulders to the whiplashes, to the crown of thorns, to everything, it's just
back of the head you can see too.
Nobody, as I said, if this was a court of law and that evidence was presented, whoever committed this crime would have been put away on that evidence alone, because all the evidence is there. So I think that's why it's taboo. It's because it's like faith meets science. But I never had a doubt that this is the Shroud of Christ, the burial Shroud of Christ. I did have a problem for a while with hair. As you can see from this graphic that you're showing, Scotty, the head is raised. That's my point.
Yes.
I feel that the head was raised, definitely. It wasn't flat on the ground. So his head was raised by something, but his hair fell down through the center, as you can see on the back, and the sides of his hair are covering his ears. That's why his hair is covering his ears at the front, which would not be normal if he was just lying down, because his hair would fall back.
Right.
And you wouldn't see it.
And if you look at just the 3D artist conception, what does hair do anyway? It shows him here with having hair that looks like this.
Yeah, but if that isn't exactly accurate. If he was just lying on a flat surface, his hair would not be there. It would be back from his face. It would.
Yes.
And unless if it was totally matted with blood or something like that, it might be around his face or whatever. But you can clearly see that the hair that is coming down on either side of his face is pretty straight. So it's almost like it's propped up by something, right?
Yes.
And I don't want to read too much into that, but it's one thing that people always bring up. Why is his hair in that position? It doesn't make any sense. Well, I do feel that his head was propped up on some way, either on a stone, or it mightn't have been a ritualistic thing. His head just might have been propped up. So that would explain why his hair was forward and why the blood was running into his hair. And that would correspond with the back of the shroud as well, because you don't see the hair at the back.
Now, it's interesting. When I was doing the illustrations on this book for this author, he gave me very specific, and I wish I could get my hands on some of those illustrations. Some of them were lost when my computer crashed 3 years ago.
Oh dear!
I did those illustrations. I turned them all over to him 5-6 years ago. But finding some of those, so I had them on hand, was ridiculous. I might have. There's one. I'm going to see if I can find it. I'll look for it in a second here. But I want to show you this image. I just downloaded this from the internet. I was looking for something that would show the back of Jesus' head, and I didn't find one per se. However, I found an interesting image that's been souped up technologically to see more of the detail in the shroud. And I'm gonna bring that up here in a second. Hold on. I'm just saving it. I had to blow it up a little bit in Photoshop so we could all see some detail here. Saving it as a PDF, and I'm going to bring this up so we can. This shows a pretty good shot of the back of his head, or the back of the image on the shroud. So let's go right here, and we will present, and from my computer, and upload, and it is this one right here somewhere. There it is. Okay, this will take a couple of seconds to upload.
This is from the shroud.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now
if you if you look at the back of the shroud, you see that
the back is on the right-hand side here. You see the hair.
You see that line that's going down the back of his head. That's where the hair is falling down between two blocks or stones that are keeping his head upright.
Head raised up.
I see what you're saying.
You know, and if you look at it, it's quite obvious.
Yeah,
because you can't see if he was lying on a flat surface, the hair would be splayed out.
Sure,
but you can see where the hair right at the back of his head is falling down.
I don't know what the customs were, the traditions, but it does.
It might not have been ritualistic. It might just have been the way he was lying.
Not make sense.
Head.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but in order for somebody to kind of fake this and go, well, people are going to ask about the position of his hair, and we want his hair around his face, because it's Christ. He had long hair, so we want to show that. And then somebody else will say, well, his hair would fall back from his face. Oh, I tell you what we'll do. We'll paint it or fake it in such a way that on the back we'll show the hair is falling down in the center, but it's kind of held up on the front. That doesn't make any sense.
Rapid Dog, what are you asking there? What are you reacting to with that? I'm not sure. I missed when you said it. So
he's probably asking, what the hell are you talking about? So I've studied the
shroud. He asked the question, why would anybody want it not to be true? And I asked that, and then he said, So was there something we said that made you go, what? And you go, what? Yeah.
Now the other thing is the dislocation of the shoulders is obvious, right?
Yes.
The position of the body is perfect, and anatomically it's perfect. So what we're into now, what stained the shroud? Well, that's when you're into something, scientists have tried to claim, it's in a very, very extreme adrenaline rush combined with sweat and blood and prolonged torture, which possibly could stain a cloth, especially linen, but not in that way, Okay, so that's where faith comes in. That's it's possible that
like
because there's no other explanation as to why the cloth is stained. The scientists are saying it's possible to stain cloth with an extreme release of what they call eccrine, which is extreme adrenaline rush of sweat and blood and agony and fear, which can stain surfaces, but not across the
not like a detailed photograph, though.
Not like a detailed photograph, but it is possible. And then
it is possible.
And then we haven't even got into like the camera obscura. The camera obscura was invented, very early on. I think
1400s, wasn't it?
1400s by Islamic.
It wasn't
guy,
Da Vinci
actually.
that created it, was it?
No, it wasn't. It was an Islamic guy. And it's just a pinhole of sunlight, on a 13-foot piece of linen, and it just what happens, and the sunlight kind of spreads across, and then
they want to date the cloth to 1352.
Yeah, exactly. And the camera obscura, when they spread the linen across this mock-up, and they let the sunlight do its job through the pinhole, it did actually stain the cloth over the mock-up of the body, which they did very similar to the Turin shroud. Now, what they were trying to prove is that scientifically it is possible through camera obscura. Who knows? Because, after all, if you're talking about the Son of God here, who knows that this wasn't just like, a flash of something, like what the camera obscura could have done, that just stained his image onto the shroud.
Right.
So this is where, obviously
of energy.
The Shroud of Turin cannot be explained exclusively scientifically, but there's enough scientific evidence in there for the scientists to go, to scratch their heads and go, well, we don't know what this is, but this is kind of weird, and also the age of the shroud. You can, disregard the original test because they were all taken from the corners, and of course the shroud.
Yeah, they only took a piece of sample.
Yeah.
Exactly. Let me ask for a second here, Rapid Dog. What makes you think that the Shroud of Turin is Jacques de Molay? He died in like 1301 or something.
Plus he was burnt alive, so I don't think he.
Yeah, he makes Templar.
Yeah.
He also put a curse on the king of France.
But you're saying it happened before he was burned? What makes you think this was Jacques de Molay?
I think in his historic depictions of Jacques de Molay, it looks very like Christ on the shroud. He had the beard and the long hair and depictions.
Aragorn looked like Jesus. So did King Arthur, and so did the Grand Heroic.
got
But
another guy too that.
It's a fact.
They got another guy too that.
It's a fact that de Molay was roasted over a pit. He was roasted alive. He wasn't burnt at the stake. He was. By the time they were finished with him, there was nothing left.
Ashes.
There was nothing left.
I may understand though that he cursed the king of France before France who wanted to confiscate their wealth. He cursed him and he fought.
Yes, he did. Yes, and they both died within a year, I think. After he cursed them.
I've never heard the theory that the Shroud of Turin is of Jacques de Molay.
I think it's
Rapid
just
Dog. I'm mocking it because I think it's ridiculous, but I'm not saying I don't want you to feel insulted by that. I'm just saying that I think that's a ridiculous theory. I haven't heard anything that would give that any sort of substantive value. Where does that theory come from? What makes it is it a mainline theory or is it just something you thought of?
I think maybe Rapid Dog thinks that the Templars were the guardians of the Ark of the Covenant and all that kind of stuff. So therefore de Molay, as the leader, would have had his image
and Rapid
personified.
It says he was because an enemy of the elites. An enemy of the elites. Why would that put his image on the shroud? And not in paint, mind you. It's not pigment. It's not painted. It's not inked. It's not penciled. There's no pigment there. What would put the image of Jacques de Molay on a piece of linen? And a piece of linen which has been carbon dated now, and other forms, I don't know what they are. There's other technological forms of dating something that have placed it to the 1st century.
Yeah. And the only thing
back to the 1st century.
I'll let you guys come in. I'll stop now. But the only thing that scientists can come up with that makes any kind of scientific, quasi-scientific, because I say quasi because they can't explain why it's so even, but is an excretion from the bodily fluids.
Right.
Bodily fluids is the only thing. It's not paint. It's not ink. It's not charcoal. It's not coal. It's not fragments from the fire. This is something that's embedded within the fibers of the shroud, of the linen, and the only thing they can say that is fluid. Certain types of acidic fluid can do that, including bodily fluid can stain linen, but it's in blotches and stuff like that, and nothing. But that's the only explanation they can give, is that it's nothing that anybody put onto the linen. It's something that's embedded within the linen, in the top, very top layer, and it's something that looks like an excretion from the body, and they admit this. They said it looks like an excretion from the body. Now, if you've ever worked with or read about people who work with dead bodies, there's a lot of that. Yes. The body starts releasing fluid soon after death. And also, if there's been a huge fight or a battle or something like that, where somebody is struggling for their life, sweat and blood and adrenaline can combine to create certain enzymes that can cling to certain cloths and materials.
Yeah,
now, any pathologist would tell you this. He stand up in the court of law and say, "I've seen this," but it's not as defined as that. But I have seen, staining on cloths that bodies are wrapped in that nobody could do with paint or anything else. It's so that's the science of it. And also the last thing I'll finish now is that the origins of the shroud you can't take from where it was. They took the original samples because that was handled all down through the centuries. It was in Constantinople, I think, modern day Istanbul. They used to regularly hold it up in front of the crowds by the corner, so there's DNA contamination. But I think the more recent samples have concluded that the original plants that the shroud was made from did coincide with the time of Christ.
Right.
So they're able to date that according to when the plant died.
Well, I just called up this abstract. It says it's the right date. It's entitled "The Right Date for the Wrong Part of the Shroud of Turin." A major reason that the Shroud of Turin is dismissed from serious study in some circles is the radiocarbon date of 1260 to 1390 AD by laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona. The dating was done in 1988 and reported in 1989. Because the dates given were so out of keeping with other evidence indicating that the shroud is much older, researchers have proposed a number of ideas as to how such a recent date could have been given. The proposal with the most evidence is explained in this paper that I'm looking at right now. It appears that little attention was given to selecting suitable samples of the shroud for radiocarbon dating. Thus, the sample was selected, which is not representative of the whole cloth. How this happened and evidence for it are explained. He talks about recent articles. Let's see. I'm looking. Wow, there's a lot of information here that goes into this. Let's see. The radiocarbon dating that attracted the greatest interest and was photographed in 1898. As the photograph negative was developed, unexpectedly clear positive image emerged, so on, so on, so on. I want to get into the controversy is this. Since there's considerable historical and scientific evidence contrary to the C14 dating, which indicates that the shroud is much older, several hypotheses have been advanced to explain the discrepancy. Paul Maloney summarized the hypothesis as follows. 1, fraud by the church officials or by radiocarbon dating laboratories skewed the dates. 2, water poured on the shroud to put out the fire of 1592 or 1532 skewed the dates. 3, heat from the fire or combined with water skewed the dates. 4, a bioplastic coating caused by mold and bacteria on the fibers skewed the dates. 5, a neutron flux caused by the resurrection skewed the dates. 6, reweaving and repair in the radiocarbon dating sample area was skewed the dates. 7, carbon monoxide unique to the shroud's historic locations skewed the dates. And for each hypothesis, some comment is in order. Fraud is highly unlikely, and it's not characteristic of those involved in the dating of the shroud. Tests for water, fire damage can be done on linen, but scientifically replicating the same conditions of 1532 is impossible. If a bioplastic coating contaminated the fibers of the radiocarbon test, the sample would have had to consist of 60% contamination. Contamination, according to go on and gives a definition of this. Neutron flux and its effect on the dating of ancient linen fragments can be tested and can skew the date to reflect a more modern age. However, whether or not a neutron flux affected the shroud is absolutely unknown. And even if a neutron flux had affected the shroud, the intensity would be unknown. The reweaving and repair hypothesis has considerable evidence in its favor, which will be explored later in this paper. The carbon monoxide hypothesis is under further investigation. And so there's a number of indications that the material used for the C-14 tests was different than the material in the rest of the shroud. If it was different, it could not accurately represent the rest of the shroud. Now, this is what I've heard, is that there's evidence of strips along the edges that had been sewn in and repaired.
Well,
nuns did after the fire.
The shroud itself is not just the shroud. The shroud was placed onto a backing sheet of linen. So the shroud, I don't know whether you knew this, so it's actually double layered. The shroud is actually was stitched onto a backing sheet of linen. So if you held up the Turin shroud, you wouldn't be able to look through those burn holes, for example, because there's a secondary layer underneath that. Did you know that? Yes. So it is actually two layers, and the secondary layer was placed there after the fires, because basically they had that shroud that was full of burn holes, right? So what they did, and how they could present it to the people and have it as an emblem that they could show, like a flag or anything like that. They wouldn't wave it around with all these burn holes because the linen would tear. So they placed it onto a secondary sheet. So that caused all sorts of problems as well, because the backing sheet was much younger than the.
Well, here you have there's a guy in 1994. The radiocarbon dating, Dr. Alan Adler stated, the real problem in the radio date sampling is a sample of the C-14 taken from the middle of the cloth will not necessarily give the same C-14 date as the area they took the sample from on the side of the cloth.
Of course.
Because you only took one sample. So you can talk all you want about how reproducible the date is, but you can't talk about how accurate it is. You have no way of knowing if the area you took the C-14 sample from represents the whole cloth. That's an area which has obviously been repaired. There's cloth missing there. It's been rewoven on the edge. They even cut part of it off because it was obviously rewoven on the edge.
Yes.
The simplest explanation why the date may be off is that it's rewoven cloth where they took the sample, and that's not been tested. However, go ahead.
Plus, it's been handled.
You're right.
So we have rewoven cloth.
Many people touched it.
Many people have touched it by the edges, held it out to the crowd. Hey, I mean, thousands, hundreds of clerics and bishops, and all sorts of so there's DNA everywhere, right around the edges.
That is,
So the only way to get a true sample is to go somewhere deep, but they won't let you do that. So it's all around the edge, which you're going to get conflicting.
Well, he says his conclusion here. It says, despite the observations and scientific findings, particularly of Rogers, that the C-14 sample was not valid for dating the shroud, there have not been any headlines announcing this to rival the headlines proclaiming that the shroud was a fake. The material tested in 1988 that was taken from the Shroud of Turin was not part of the original cloth. Some percentage of the test sample may have been original material, but there was enough new material to invalidate the sample for the dating of the shroud. Harry Grove details the efforts to include 6 laboratories to date the sample, but he also reveals that relatively little attention was placed on obtaining a suitable sample, and the efforts to obtain multiple samples from the shroud were rejected. Thus, the date for the shroud of 1260 to 1390 cannot be valid. This scientific evidence should be more widely acknowledged. And it's not acknowledged because there's still people out there touting, oh, well, it's a medieval forgery. Well, don't you know about what's gone on since then? No, because that was not promulgated as much as what was promulgated was all the shrouds are fake because it only dates to the medieval period. Well, they didn't promulgate as much the news that that's false, that was a bad test. And
They only cut a little piece of strip of it. They didn't test the whole entire cloth itself.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, and I think the scientific evidence is they only allowed the shroud to be cut in certain areas, but it has been extensively X-rayed.
Yeah.
The shroud itself, right?
Yep.
And it was decided to allow scientists to do that because it wouldn't damage the linen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where they got the results about the botanists got the results about the age of the cloth
Yes.
corresponding to the time of Christ, because they were able to tell from the X-rays the age of the linen based on you know, for want of a better word, the death of the plants that created
right.
it. And that was all done by X-ray.
This is very interesting as he goes on in his conclusion. He says, returning to the negative response to the Shroud of Turin cited at the beginning of this paper, it is now possible to read the research published by Rogers showing that this carbon-14 sample did not represent the Shroud of Turin and that the shroud is much older. Furthermore, it's possible to read the support for Rogers' contention by other knowledgeable chemists. A response can also be given to the argument that the shroud is obviously a fraud because lots of fraudulent religious icons were being produced at the time the shroud first appeared in Europe. While it's true that there are many manufactured religious icons, the Shroud of Turin presents an enigma. First of all, why would a forger go to such extensive trouble to produce the shroud when it was easy to make a fake relic and sell it as genuine?
Why did I say, what was I saying earlier on?
Yep.
Nobody could have done this, and nobody could have thought of all of these different things.
No, they could not have.
Dominic Crossman,
he says there are details on the shroud invisible to the naked eye.
Yeah.
In the blood flows, the chemistry of the blood on the shroud that medical doctors and chemists have documented to be medically accurate. The microscopic pollen found on the shroud indicated an origin in Jerusalem. In addition, that's the Denon, Wenger, Baruch, and Wenger in 1999.
Yeah, they were able to date that pollen to the pollen that was around the first century. I mean, what more evidence do you need?
Well, he goes on. He says, in addition, how would a medieval forger know to put microscopic amounts of calcium unique to Jerusalem in the areas of the feet and the knees? Also, the art of medieval Europe shows details of the crucifixion known to be historically inaccurate that differ from details on the shroud, which are historically accurate. Why would a forger step out of his contemporary time frame to do this? Additionally, the method of production of other relics can easily be determined, but the image on the shroud has not been fully explained or replicated to this day. It may be scientific to assume that the shroud is a fake based on the premise that there is a naturalistic explanation for everything, but that the premise is challenged by the Shroud of Turin. Scientific study of the shroud has not proven it to be a fake. On the contrary, reviewing 25 years of scientific study, Raymond Rogers wrote as follows of the shroud. He wrote, I believe that the technology of the cloth indicates a much greater age than shown by the 1988 date. I believe that we can prove categorically without any assumptions that the sample taken in 1988 was invalid. I believe that the image could not be a hoax based on its chemical composition. I believe that the shroud is a real shroud. I believe that those opinions are all that can be justified on the basis of the facts and observations we now have. However, no observations to date rule out the possibility that the shroud may very well be the actual shroud used with Jesus. My conclusion is that the shroud may be the most important object in history. It deserves only the most careful, meticulous study and careful preservation. And by the way, that is why you can look at the shroud and say it is the most, absolutely most researched archaeological artifact in history because of what it's supposed to represent, who is behind it, who would gain by it not being accurate, who would gain by it being accurate. There's been so much study done on this that if you take any other relic that exists, any other antiquity that exists, and you put as much study into it as you have the shroud, there would be absolutely nobody questioning it. But they still question the shroud because it represents a faith issue.
Yes, and that's the taboo I was referring to earlier on. So that's exactly my point. My point. It's a major taboo because what it does, it introduces a direct collision of science and faith. The scientists are like, "Whoa, we don't want to go there because this is too scientific. We can't explain this." And
take that X-ray fluorescence. Just type that in regarding the shroud and see if they've done a study with that. It'd be interesting to find out. So I know they've done every other study that exists to try to determine what it is. All they know is what it isn't for sure. It isn't paint. It isn't ink. It isn't pigment. It isn't fake.
But it is an excretion of some kind. It is an excretion on the cloth. In other words, the cloth it didn't form miraculously on the cloth. It is an excretion.
Yeah.
Even before Jesus was crucified, in the Gospel of Luke, it tells us that he was so afraid when the Garden of Gethsemane that he began to sweat drops of blood in his sweat, and that's hematidrosis that's caused by extreme fear and anxiety. So that is there in the Gospel of Luke.
Yeah. And that Corinthians, by the way, remember that I mentioned Corinthians?
Yes.
I don't read the Bible, but that
Sure.
a few things popped out at me. There is a passage, I think it's 7:14, where it says, "Seek my face." If you seek my face.
Oh yes, if my people who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, and I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land.
I just thought that seek my face was an interesting way.
I think that's more a poetic metaphor for saying,
possibly
look me up.
Yeah.
So,
maybe
rabid dog. So the people that are saying it's fake is because they're denying Jesus was real. Yeah, I think that's probable.
Yeah. I think there's it's a major taboo, but I think you have to look at the shroud. I look at the shroud anyway after studying it. In that it's a case of Occam's razor. What's the simplest explanation? It's the shroud of Christ. Everything points it to being the shroud. of Christ.
I've been in the same position you've been in, Susie Q. No way to know for sure if it's him, except. You have to look at the evidences we gave earlier. If you were to take those evidence into a court of law, you would win your case.
Oh yeah.
If it was something else,
hands down. If this is a murder, if there was a body,
1 in 2 billion.
If this is a murder case and there was a body wrapped in that, and all the evidence was placed about the crucifixion and where the wounds were and what happened afterwards, the case won.
Yep.
And so the idea of it being a forgery is ludicrous.
Yeah.
Even today they would struggle to think of everything. How are we going to pull this off? How are we going to pull this off? Because somebody, especially a relic that's going to get so much attention. How are we going to cover all our bases here? How are we going to tick every box? So no matter where you look, I mentioned the hair thing earlier on, and then I had a problem with the hair thing for a long time. I was like, the hair is not right. Why is the hair up around there? But it does explain when you look at the back of the shroud that you see the hair coming down through the middle of his head. You can see so his head was raised and resting on something. Certainly,
more or less when they put him in the tomb.
Yeah. So that's how I feel. I have
and I believe that
a big
Joseph of Arimathea too was
a big portrait of
Arimathea must have been a relative of Jesus, because in order for him to make a tomb of his own that would be a tomb that no man was laid in and put Jesus in that there, I believe that Joseph of Arimathea was a relative of Jesus for sure. I don't know that.
By the way, Susie Q, when we use and I've used these arguments, I know what you're saying, Susie. When we say no exceptions, sorry, no proof, period. This is part of a control plan. They needed something tangible, so they created one, perhaps. See, now that kind of thing is like saying We know Julius Caesar wore red. Well, how do we know that? Well, because contemporaries of his day said he wore red. Well, do we have any evidence that he actually wore red? Do we find any of his garments? How do we know that those contemporaries weren't making that up because purple was the color for imperial colors? Why would they say he wore red? Maybe it was to degrade the fact that he wore purple and they didn't want him to come across as a royal. Or maybe, see, this is the kind of argumentation that goes on, is that you have to look at evidence. You have to look what people write. You have to look at the context of the time it was written, what people are saying. If the evidences we have that that Jesus, all the things that happened to him in the crucifixion story are identical to the guy who is on the cloth, the likelihood of all of those things being the same is so astronomically high that statistically it says these would be the same person. Now, do we know it for sure without a shadow of a doubt? No. That's where belief comes in.
That's where belief comes in.
Yeah.
But it's pretty much a slam dunk. I mean, there's always going to be, okay. You can't call it percentage wise. But one thing that kind of, if you want a miracle, introduce a miracle into the argument, then you look at the camera obscura and what they're able to achieve through sunlight, and they were able to achieve something very similar to the Turin shroud using the camera obscura, pinhole of light, just let the sun shine and come down. So who's to say that there wasn't this flash of light, a burst of energy that showed Christ just as he was when he was taken down from the cross, and all of those excretions and the sweat and the staining and his agony was amplified and stained onto the cloth for the faithful, for people who believe that in him. I can think, that makes perfect sense for somebody who believes in Jesus Christ, that something like that would occur. How it survived over the centuries, being burnt and manhandled, and it still survived. So, taking all of these things into account, I would 100% believe that the shroud is genuine.
And I was going to say this for Susie Q. I have to quote that great scientist, Mr. Spock, from Star Trek. But we all know this comes from other sources as well. He said, when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And he says it takes work, however, for those around him to adopt those views.
Yeah, it's Occam's razor, in other words.
Possibilities instead of impossibilities.
Yeah.
Is the growth opportunity.
It's like, that's why it's taboo, because the people are desperate to disprove it, but science can't disprove it. So it's become the ultimate taboo. So I've met people of faith over the years who don't believe in the shroud, and I'm like, what else do you want? Did you want Christ to come walking up to your door and knocking on your door? To me, there's no greater evidence. There is no other powerful evidence apart from the words and the scriptures, but there is this, and everything about it is like designed not just to make us believe, but to show scientifically that something very strange happened to that clock.
Right.
Yes.
And did it happen to an average guy who was taken down off a cross or killed or murdered or what? No. We can see the crown of thorns. We can see the wounds.
The crown of thorns is on the shroud, but that was not a common practice.
Yeah,
for
it wasn't
crucifixion.
become. Of course not. Of course not. And we can see the wounds in his hands, and we can see the dislocation. All the different elements that the whippings
He was
that
mocked.
that are
He
mentioned.
was mocked and whipped
Yeah. So
because they proclaim him as king of the Jews. So
yeah. And I suppose in a way it also makes a sense that no, the Son of God was personified as a human being on earth, right? So therefore, it would also be logical to assume that his agony was probably an agony that no human being could possibly comprehend. So the agony that was excreted onto that cloth was the agony of for all mankind, you know?
Sure. But here's the question.
Yeah.
Would he have to be going through that agony for that to appear? Because this was supposedly after his death.
I think
He's not excreting that anymore. This,
well, he's
whatever
covered,
made
he's
that
co-
image
he's
would
co-
have
he's-
been some kind of energy that made that happen.
It's a combination, probably,
Yeah.
of an energy from, that's why I like the camera obscura idea. It's something that just burnt his image
flash
on.
of light or something.
Yeah. And also his body would have been covered in sweat and hours and hours. And in that climate, his
Very
body
72 hours,
would not have been dry. You know, they
Right.
didn't wash the body at that stage. They might have
Right.
wiped
They
the
didn't
face.
wash. And it was two members of the
Sabbath was a
Sanhedrin that
virgin.
took him to the grave, not his family.
Yeah. So he would
So
have
they
been
didn't
covered.
wash him up.
He was covered in sweat and blood and hours of agony, plus the agony that was in his own head. You know, so that agony is, in my opinion, perfectly personified with on the shroud.
And by the
Now-
way, Susie, I'm not arguing that anybody needs to change their faith.
No.
We're just talking about the object itself. If the object itself separated from faith, what if it's real? What if it's exactly what they say it is? That doesn't have to change who you are. Alien Jesus, maybe. There's some dopes that like to purport that Jesus was alien. Not you, Susie. I don't know that you're putting that forward. I think you're saying somebody else says that. I think that's an idiot explanation for who he was. I think he was a guy. I think he was, it won't change me either. Hasn't changed me for 50 years. It's not going to change me now. But I think it'd be like finding the Ark of the Covenant to me. Having the Shroud of Turin be something that we could, if we could prove that it was the image of Jesus of Nazareth, be extraordinary. It'd be as extraordinary as finding the Ark of the Covenant to me. Those are all things that now maybe there's more salvific nature to the finding of, but see, Susie, I think, and for Rapid Dog and anybody else, Susie, your take is not meant at all to be hostile. It's not meant to be negative. You're just stating your position. But you know what? That's exactly what the scientists who are trying to disprove it are doing. They're doing the same thing. They need to ignore the facts and try to explain away everything. They're not trying to find a good answer. They're trying to find ways to explain away the solid answers.
Exactly.
And because it's not going to change who they are anyway. So, and for here, I'm going to put forward a theory, Susie, for you, for me, for anybody. If we could prove the Shroud of Turin was really the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, would that validate the story of his being the Son of God and dying for the sins of mankind? Would that validate that for us? If suddenly we learned without a shadow of a doubt that the image on the shroud is a miracle from God, a miracle of the moment of resurrection, which as far as we know has never happened before.
No.
So that to me right there is a good, your little explanation there of how you feel about it actually open up my eyes to say, I think that's the way the guys that want to deny it feel. They're the same thing. They don't want to be changed from what they believe. So there's no amount of trying to prove it that's going to change them because they're satisfied where they are. And no, not for you. You mean that doesn't apply to you? Or if it was proven, it would not apply to you. I don't know. So yeah, I mean that's what it is to me. It's still always going to come down to personal choice. I don't think there is a definitive answer on this because I think, like everything else that frustrates me about Christianity and God, it's all about faith.
It's not
Yeah,
all
it's
about
about
faith, though.
belief.
In the case of the shroud, I'll let you go now. But in the case of the shroud, as you read out, there's a significant amount of scientific backup. That like, hey, yeah, this is kind of strange. We can't think of anything. We can date the pollen and the plants to the exact time. There's nothing that we know of. It's some kind of excretion. It looks, pathologists, would claim that, it looks like bodily excretions, but nothing that we know of can do it in that uniform pattern.
Yep.
So scientifically, they're kind of saying that this is a scientific piece, but we can't kind of, but it doesn't make sense to them. So, in other words, if it was just a piece of it and there was a blotch on it, they could kind of say, "Oh yeah, there's a blotch there because that's blood and sweat and that's pollen, and that's when it was made." If it was just a square, but an entire 13-foot long, that's where they say
it's big.
That's how does that happen? But that's why I think quintessentially the shroud will remain mysterious and taboo because science has given a lot away in that, it's not a fake. They've heavily got involved. There's countless books written on it. They've tried their best to scientifically stand up and say, look, this is naturally occurring situation of some kind. But all I think it was somebody else I read, as I told you earlier on, is that if this was in a court of law and it was put in any other situation, it would be proof undeniable.
Right.
And
I've got to say to Rapid Dog here, he says it doesn't pass the smell test. And I would say my response to that Rapid Dog would be, yeah, it does. It passes the smell test beyond recognition. But it's like even Jesus himself, was it Jesus that said, even if one were to come back from the dead, you still would not believe? Who said that?
He made a parable about Lazarus, rich man and Lazarus. I think it was when he was praying.
Was it Jesus that said that though? Is that a quote of his?
It's a parable.
Even
Jesus
if one were to come back from the dead,
they won't believe it. Yeah,
you would not believe.
Well, that's worth looking into.
That's the belief portion.
And there's also a lot of academic, not scientists or theologians, a lot of academically minded people or literary people who have read metaphors into the shroud. Yes. And they said, well, he knew that he'd have a hard time convincing everybody about what he went through and what he was trying to do and what has been written about him. So he's going to give us this, and we're going to be arguing about it for centuries. But I'm going to give you my death shroud. It's like, when you think about it like that, it makes perfect sense. It's like, you won't have the cross I've been nailed to. You won't have the nails. You won't have my body. But look, I've given you this, and it's an exact replica, not a replica, but exact personification of what I went through.
Yep.
And
by the way, that was in the book of Luke, where you find that. It was verse. Hang on. What verse was it? 31. So Luke 16:31. It's supposed to be Jesus. It's Jesus talking. he says there's an argument going on, the rich man and Lazarus. He gives that. And it says there was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and so on and so on. And we know the story. And it says Lazarus, or not Lazarus, the rich man is in hell, burning in the flames or something. And he says, I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them so that they will not also come to this place of torment. Abraham replied, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. And he replies, no, Father Abraham, he said, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent. And he said to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. So it was the story Jesus was telling. So.
Yeah. You know, you know, I mean, the resurrection of Christ is the real deal here. We're talking about, you know, there's a lot of faith hinges on the resurrection of Christ, and I suppose at the time of Roman antiquity, Scotty, you know this, the Romans had no time for people rising from the dead. They were materialists, you know. They were atomists, you know. So just a myth about the resurrection. Perhaps it's almost like a cosmic giggle, in a way. You know, it's like, you know, I know you guys are not going to believe I rose from the dead, but I'm going to give you my shroud and let you figure it out, you know. And I think that's what the shroud was about. I think that it was meant to represent Christ's agony, and it was also meant to represent the truth of what he went through. So that agony was perfectly
and I think the people that don't want to believe that the shroud could be real are the people that just don't want to believe the message that's behind it anyway.
Well, that's it. You know,
see, it's like, well, I choose to not believe that, therefore the shroud can't be real.
Yeah.
It can't be of Jesus because I choose to not believe that Jesus was the accurate way to believe.
Yeah. So that's the stumbling block. Anyway, fascinating conversation. Sorry to go on so long.
It is, and I've gone way late.
Yeah, but
I'm like an hour over. So what I normally do.
Great topic though, and it's just a topic that's very close to my heart.
It's a great topic. I'd like to know more about what's on the shroud than I do, because I think it's a fascinating topic. And
might talk about it again at some stage.
Yeah, we'll do it again. I want to get Barry Schwartz on here to talk about it. So
all right, I'll let you go for now. I have to go to bed.
Yeah, you got to go to bed so you can get up in an hour.
Yeah, all right, man. Good. See you, Mr. Barbados. All right. I'll see you later, Scotty.
Good to see you, Niall.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good night. Thank you, Susie Q. Much love right back at you. Thanks for being here. Captain Barbados, good to have you here tonight. It's been a long time since we've seen you. So everybody was asking about you the other night. I said, I don't know what happened to him. You're not on Facebook as far as I know, so I couldn't message you over there. So... But
how is Ruben Fasthorse doing?
How what's that?
How is Ruben Fasthorse doing?
He's better, but he's alive. He's healthy physically, but his brain's not working right. So I talked to him on the telephone about a week ago, and very happy, very up, very energetic, but. His brain center, his memory center of his brain is damaged. And I can tell him, I'll say to him, hey, Misu, it's your big brother, your Chia, it's Scotty. And he goes, yes. He said, Misu. He says, Scotty, yes. But by the end of the conversation, he won't know my name because it's not retaining. And, which has got to be tough for a linguist like him. So he remembers a lot of things. He knows who Susie is. He knows who I am. That's the thing. He just can't put language to it anymore. So like what's frustrating to him is he has all those memories of us and everything trapped in his brain, but he can't access them. He can't access the details, and it's frustrating. You can tell he's frustrated by it. So
it would be.
Thank you, Sean Stroik. So that's how he's doing. I'll keep everybody updated as much as I can, and I'd like to get out to see him. So
yeah,
and visit him. Anyway, so he's in a facility, not the hospital anymore, but a medical facility that's supposed to help him.
Recuperate.
What's the word I'm looking for? My brain's tired right now. Not recuperate, not therapy, not it's like PT for the brain, physical therapy for the brain therapy, to try to help him. And they're hoping that as he heals, that memory could come back. So, but we don't know. So we'll find out. Anyway, that's it.
Yeah.
So you have a good Easter, brother.
Same to you.
And it's nice to see you. I'm glad you made it back in tonight. Thanks for staying on.
Thanks very much. Okay.
All right. See you later, Matthew. All right, everybody else. That's it. I hope you enjoyed the show. I felt it was a little disjointed at places, but I hope we got all the information across. It's an interesting topic. We just don't know what to do with it. If it's true, it has implications. If it's real. If it can't be proven real, does that eliminate the implications? No. But it eliminates our need to have to consider the implications if we can't prove it. Does it need to be proven? No, because I think it's all a faith thing to begin with. Those who are going to believe it because they have faith that it's real. Those who don't. The scientists that have changed their minds about it and believe that it's real are the ones that have gone through 4 decades of research, of the most researched artifact in the history of archaeology, and have found that there's no possible way it could be anything but miraculous. Does that prove that Jesus is God? No. Nope. That's the faith part. The not faith part is this. It's not a fake, and nothing natural caused it. That's been proven over and over and over again. There shouldn't even be any question. Any thinking or critically thinking person shouldn't be able to question those things. They question them because they don't want to accept that it might be real. That's, I think, what's at the core. Or it goes against everything about their bias about it. So whether or not it's real is a faith issue. Accepting who is the object on it is a faith issue. Accepting that it's real is not hard at all, because it's been proven that there's nothing it can be but real. Big question is, who is it on the picture? So there you go. What if Jesus faked his own death? I've heard that. Wasn't that the topic of the last temptation of Christ? What if he faked his death? See, that's about as much of a what if as what if that's Jesus on the shroud. They're all what ifs. We don't know. Maybe. Could have been. All depends on what your starting point is. On whether you accept that as a theory, a working theory, a workable theory, or a ridiculous theory. They're all theories. Our starting point and our bias is what determines whether or not we think it has veracity. Yeah. Nah, why? Why would that story be concocted? If you look at the character and the attributes of Jesus, as from the information we know about him, Does that seem within his wheelhouse, his character, to do that? I don't think so. I don't think so. That theory is eliminated for me just on the basis of his character. So at least the character that's presented to us. So anyway, that's all. I got to get out of here. My brain's starting to fade for the night, and yours probably are too. Thank you for sticking it out with the show, everybody. Thank you for being here. I appreciate your presence. That's all I got. So in the meantime, live long and prosper. And I'm going to send us out on, we never did do the Captain's Cabin, but I talked right through the break. So here we are. Let's go. Live long and prosper. See you on Sunday morning, Easter Sunday. Bye.